and began to feed him, humming a song under her breath as she did so. A hand rested on her cheek, making her look up, and her eyes meet with grey eyes, like as fine as mist. She smiled and leaned forward as Ned leaned down, and their lips met in the middle, a warmth flooding through her and settling in her chest. Once Torrin had drunken his fill and had been settled in his crib besides his brother, they found themselves sitting on the large padded long bench, Elia half in Ned's lap as they watched the fire lazily burning in the hearth. The nursery was one of the warmest rooms in the entire castle, but the day had been a cold one and she didn't want either of the children to become sick, and thus she had ordered one be built. It was uncomfortable for Ned, her husband preferred it to be colder, she knew that, and often she had offered him the chance to leave, but he had made no acknowledgement of those chances and simply stayed with them for longer. But she was a princess of Dawn and the heat was welcome to her, and indeed it was nothing compared to her a warm day in Dawn itself. She was fairly certain that she had been about to fall asleep with her head on Ned's shoulder when there was a sudden, sharp tapping on the door. Elia moved away from Ned, although she did let out a small, frustrated moan as her husband stood up and walked over to the door, pulling it open. Elia was still drifting and was closer to sleep than she was to being awake, so she hadn't heard anything that had been said, and she was brought back to the world of waking by Ned's hand on her shoulder, gently shaking her. "Elia, wake up. You need to come. It's my father." The words nearly snapped her back into the waking world so quickly that for a moment Elia didn't recognize where she was or what she had been doing, but the confusion had only lasted for a moment before what Ned had told her actually managed to sink in. She almost jumped up from where she had been sitting as she stared at husband. "I'm sorry. It's my father, he's here. He just turned up a few moments ago." Ned seemed as surprised as she felt, relieved as she felt, but still as surprised. Neither of them had expected Lord Ricard to appear today, they hadn't expected him to appear at all. 1,001 questions buzzed inside her mind like a nest of rabbit hornets, and once she had sorted through them as best as she could, she found that she had another 1,000 to ask. And yet she got the feeling that she wasn't going to get 1,000 answers. She squared her shoulders and gave Ned what she hoped was a comforting smile as she reached down and took his hand. "Well then, we had best go and welcome home, mustn't we?" Ned nodded and led her over to the door. The Stark guardsman was waiting for them on the outside, and he began to lead them through the corridors and out through the courtyard towards the Great Hall. As they made their way to the Great Hall, Elia caught sight of Hodder leading a fine grey steed over to the stables, and Elia knew that it was her good father's personal horse and that he had truly returned to them. As they walked into the Great Hall, the first thing that Elia caught sight of was Lord Ricard standing as tall as a king, his arms wrapped around Lyanna as though he hadn't seen her in a dozen years. It had felt longer than it had been. In her mind Elia knew that it could really only have been a single moon or so since he had actually left the north, but it had felt far longer than that to the people of Winterfell. Lyanna let go of her father, and Elia saw that her eyes and her cheeks were wet with tears. Benjen came rushing in from the Lord's door with Brandon and Catelyn behind him. The youngest of the Starks threw his arms around his father's middle and held to him so tightly, as if terrified that if he let go then his father might disappear again. The sight broke her heart. Brandon and Cat approached from the side just as Elia and Ned approached the dais from the front and ascended the steps to stand on the platform. As she got closer to her good father, Elia noticed that he seemed quite tired, far more tired than he had been when he had left, and she was sure that she noticed a few strands of silver running through his brown hair and extra lines on his face. Wherever he had been and whatever he had done, it had aged him. "Father." Ned spoke with a smile on his face. He stepped away from Elia and threw his arms around his father at the same time Brandon did. Benjen was hidden behind his brothers, and Elia was fairly sure that he was being as crushed as his father was at the moment. Elia caught sight of Cat, who was smiling at the reunion, and went to stand by her, a smile on her own face as she did so. "I am glad you returned unharmed." Lord Ricard returned the smile and patted his younger son on the shoulder. "And I am glad to be back in the north again. I trust that none of you spoke the truth of where I truly was?" he asked, and then nodded satisfied when they all answered in the negative. "Good, now I am sure that you all have questions that you need to ask me, and I understand that, but I am tired and at the moment all I want is a bath, a roast bird and a feather bed. We can speak later in the evening. Lai, can you please send Maester Wallers to come and attend me? There are things that must be discussed." Lyanna nodded, and with that, Lord Ricard left the hall through the Lord's door like he hadn't been there to start with. Lyanna glanced at her brothers and shrugged her shoulders before she went off to find the Maester. Benjen looked disappointed for a few moments before he began to walk towards the direction of the yard. Soon it was only Brandon, Ned, Elia and Kat left in the hall. "Well, it's good to know that he's still the same," Brandon muttered as he rubbed at the back of his neck. Ned frowned slightly, which made his older brother let out a groan. "Oh Ned, loosen bloody up. How you can even have a shit sometimes." "It was a joke. I'm as glad as you are that father's fine, but that doesn't mean that I don't get tired when he decides to not tell us anything." Ned frowned, and while Elia couldn't know what he was thinking, she had something of an idea. She had to assume that it was close to what she was thinking herself. For as long as her good father had been away, she knew there had been speculation as to what he had been doing among all those who knew the truth that he had no longer been in the north. Which had only included herself, Ned, Brandon, Kat, Lionel, Benjen, Ashura and the Maester. Brandon had thought that he had decided to abandon his place as the Lord of Winterfell and retire to a free city, to spend the rest of his life somewhere warm without telling them. Kat had not agreed with that, not thinking that Lord Rickard would be a man who would obey on his family. She had in fact suggested that he had gone to find a match in the south and had kept it a secret as so not to offend the northern lords. Benjen had suggested that he might have gone over to Essos but to stay. Instead he had gone to find hidden dragon eggs which only his father knew where they were, and was going to come back with dragons for all of them. Lionel didn't much care where her father had gone and only wanted to make sure that he was actually coming back. Ashura did know that he was no longer in the north, but she hadn't been one for speculating the past few months. She had fallen into a grim mood, and not even Lauren seemed to be enough to bring a smile onto her face anymore, which did little to make the child happy. Ashura had been drifting about the castle as though she were a ghost, her hands drifting over her stomach as she walked. She knew what it meant, but she had hoped that Brandon wouldn't have done it now that he had been wed to Catelyn. That had clearly been a mistake on her part, but Brandon didn't seem to be neglecting Kat's bed either. The brightness around the other woman as of late and the slight swelling of her belly was clearly evidence enough of that. Elia didn't understand how two men could be so very different from one another. She knew that Ned would never be like this. Had it been Jon Arryn alone who had made the Ned that she had always known, the honorable man that she had grown to love so very easily. Still, she had not said anything to Ned about it yet. Men did not have an eye for such a thing, and Ashura was still in very early days yet, and she had taken to wearing thicker clothes as of late. It had grown colder as of late, and many in Winterfell had taken to wearing warmer clothing as of late, even in the warmest parts of the castle. She had even heard one of the maids who worked in the kitchen speaking of how there would be no chance of any harvest now until spring came. Old Nan had said that she didn't think that the season was going to be much further away now. She had lived through 100 winters, and in most of them before they ended there was always a sharp burst of cold before the winter's snows gave way to the spring breeze. But Elia had a feeling that the sharp cold would continue to persist inside the walls of the castle even when the winds of spring warmed the land outside. Elia didn't know how long she would be able to keep it a secret. Eventually Ashura's condition would be found out, and then all seven hells would break loose inside the walls. And she was terrified of what would happen to Ashura when others did find out. She already had one bastard, but no one aside from herself and Ashura knew about the one growing in her belly. Kat would know soon enough, and while she wouldn't be rude enough to say anything about it out loud, she would start to wonder who the father was and if the babe came out looking more like a Stark. It was exhausting having to deal with all of this. When one problem was over, it seemed as though another popped up to replace it. It made her tired. Sometimes she considered just ignoring it and focusing on Ned and her sons and letting everything else sort itself out. But she knew that she couldn't do that. Ashura meant too much to her, Lauren meant too much to her, and the babe that was growing inside of her meant something as well. It might have been time for Ashura to return to Dorne. She would miss her more than anything in the world, but Ashura hadn't been happy in Winterfell for a while. Going back to Dorne might have been best for her now. Ashura loved Starfall more than anywhere else in the world, and her family would take her back in within open arms, though any chance of her being married now was lost somewhat. Even in Dorne, a woman having two bastards of her own would dampen her chances of a decent marriage. But sending her back there would keep her away from Brandon. Ashura wouldn't be tempted. Brandon wouldn't be able to break his vows with her friend, and Catelyn would never need to know the truth. Doran could prove a wrinkle in those plans. He had been the one who commanded Ashura to come with her and serve as her lady, but if Elia said that she didn't want Ashura serving her anymore, then that would be the end of it. Still, she would have to ask her friend exactly what she wanted to do, though a part of Elia, although she would always miss her, wished that Ashura did agree to go back to Dorne. just to make everything that little bit more simpler. But in the end Elia would listen to what Ashura chose to do. Her friend had never been someone to like it when decisions were made for her, and that had been something that they always had in common. Ned still frowned heavily as he crossed his arms over his chest, staring firmly at his older brother. I grow tired of it as well, but I also grow tired of you making a joke out of every single thing that ever happens. You're going to be Lord of Winterfell and Lord Paramount of the North one day, and more than likely the Warden of the North. You have to grow up at some point. Brandon's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He just pushed past his brother and stormed out of the hall. Catelyn's hands came down to hover over her stomach for a moment before she offered them an apologetic smile. The lady then made her excuses and followed after her husband, leaving Ned and Elia alone for the time being. The hall suddenly seeming darker, colder. But when Ned turned to smile at her, the cold did not seem as present as it had. I think I shall go to the Godswood, to give thanks to the gods for bringing father back safely. Would you like me to escort you back to the nursery first? I thought that I might accompany you to the Godswood. I will not disturb your prayers, of course. Ned didn't frown at her words, not exactly. But he did seem at loss for a moment before he found the words to speak. If that is what you wish to do, my lady, but it is quite cold this day. I have a thick fur, I shall be well. And in truth, I should like some peace and quiet in which to think, and the few times I have been there I have found no place in Winterfell to be more peaceful. Or more disturbing, in its way. There was always the sense that someone didn't want her there, but the Seven hadn't offered her any answers or any peace. Perhaps the gods of the south could not reach them here. Of course, if you would prefer some time alone, my love, then I understand. No, no, of course not. If you wish to come with me, then I would be glad of your company. Ned reached out to take her hand, and Elia smiled as she felt the warmth under his skin enveloping her smaller hand. How had she ever thought that he was a cold man? How had that ever been a fear that she had? A man who filled her with nothing but warmth now. They walked out through the courtyard and through the gate into the Godswood, and soon enough found themselves in front of the heart tree. Ned knelt in front of it and Elia took a seat on a fallen tree trunk next to the steaming black pool. A cold wind blew through the Godswood and caused her bones to shake and her teeth to chatter, and for a moment she thought of taking her shoes off and dipping them into the steaming water, but she decided against. Ned might not complain, but she had the feeling that the old gods would not thank her for it. They sat together in silence, Ned's head bowed in prayer for what seemed like an eternity, and a second all at once, the sky had darkened to purple and large black clouds were looming overhead. As cold at the north in winter was in the daytime, it was nothing compared to when the sun went down. Elia stood from the trunk that had fallen and walked over to where her husband was kneeling and offered him her hand. Ned looked up at her for a moment before he took her hand and rose from the floor, brown snow clinging to his knees. Once they had returned to the nursery, Elia dismissed the wet nurse and the maid, and once she was certain that both of the babes were asleep, she turned to face Ned. I need to ask you something. Do you promise me that you won't be upset with me for asking? She waited for Ned to nod, ignoring the heavy frown that accompanied it. Your father, do you think he might have gone north to make an alliance with someone, not a marriage alliance, but you told me that he hasn't forgotten what the king had done? The thought of a war had terrified her. It had been the threat of the king's rage and the defense that the other kingdoms would give him and his house that had convinced Lord Tywine to free her from Casterly Rock, but it had only been that, a threat, one she meant to carry out, but she had been freed. It was done, in the past. She had not, nor would she ever forgive the king for what he had done, but she wanted it to be brought to an end. The north was far away from King's Landing and large besides. Ned had told her that Moat Cailin when garrisoned could hold back an army of 20,000 with only 100 men. The king may have been mad, but only a true and utter fool would ignore all of that. Of course there had been no word from the capital demanding that she be returned back to her captivity at Casterly Rock, or that news her betrothal had reached the king's ears. Perhaps the spider hadn't found out. Perhaps his little birds were not so far spread as he liked to pretend. Perhaps she was worried for nothing. It might not come to it. And yet at the same time, it might. Men could be the greatest of fools when it came to such things. They claimed to fight for family and for honor, and yet they left their family to bleed for it. At times, she simply could not understand them. And there would be blood. The realm would bleed if the North and Dawn rose up against the Targaryens. Even families could find themselves fighting amongst one another, torn apart by oaths. Ned seemed confused for a moment, but only for a moment, as his hand came up to brush over his face. He sunk down onto padded bench for a moment before he looked back up at her. Perhaps, Benjen is unmarried. Perhaps he wants to wed him to a girl from the Vale, a Royce perhaps, or maybe a Waynwood. Jon Arryn loves me well, but as for the rest of the Vale, it's the only kingdom in this little pact of my father's that hasn't gotten a marriage in there somewhere. It wouldn't surprise me. Her husband then let out a small laugh when he saw the dumbfounded look on her face, though there was a hint of weariness to the laughter to be sure. I am not so much a dunderhead when it comes to matters such as these as most would like to think. What else would my father be planning? Why would Rhaegar Targaryen give us that message if not for the support that my father has? Elia wasn't ashamed to admit that had not occurred to her before now. It seemed so much like a different world now that she had almost forgotten that the bloody letter had existed in the first place. If she closed her eyes then she could almost see both of the letters burning as she feed them both to the flames, only herself knowing what was in them, and her husband and her brother once she had recounted their contents to them. Now more than ever she wanted to know what Doran was doing, as much as she ever could understand Doran. Oberyn had once jested that the maze makers of old must have had a hand in constructing their brother's mind and how he thought. Elia was not stupid, and yet Doran had always been able to outthink her. When he had visited them while he had been at Saltshire as a squire, he had always come with a new riddle for her to figure out, and often it would take her weeks to puzzle it out. She knew that Oberyn would fight a war willingly enough, but would Doran call the banners to go to it? She honestly couldn't tell with him at times. If the rest of the people Lord Stark had reached out to also went to war against the king. Honor would bound him to rise with them, but oaths would command him to fight for the king. Rhaegar reached out to the Lannisters. Perhaps he went to Casterly Rock. Lord Tywin and the king are not on the best of terms. If Elia was the Lord of Casterly Rock, then she imagined that she would support the side with the larger numbers. Thought admittedly her knowledge of military matters was not the most comprehensive, but what she did know was that the Lannisters could mass multiple large hosts in numbers no other, except the Reach, could match. Considering the quality of the equipment that their gold could buy and the amount of gold they had, a winning side that had the Lannisters on their side would have victory almost assured. And a losing side would at least have a fighting chance. Perhaps, but Lord Tywin has no other daughters other than Princess Cersei. And from what I have heard of him, I don't think he would consent to marrying one of his daughters to a third-born son. Ned frowned slightly at his own words, and Elia knew why. Benjen was a good little man, but his position meant that he wasn't likely to have a bountiful match. Who knows, who can truly know anything? Perhaps nothing will come of this, perhaps the king will stabilize. He may fall ill and Prince Rhaegar will take the crown. And the next summer may be the eternal one, and we need never worry about the chill of winter again after this one. Elia chewed on her bottom lip for a moment before she shook her head. And yet, I doubt it. The king's mind is failing him, and he eats little and less, and yet he seems determined to cling on to his life for the nonce. Perhaps simply to spite us if nothing else. Perhaps. Ned said before he walked over to her and pulled her into his arms, gently rubbing at her back. Elia let out a heavy sigh and closed her eyes as she sunk into the embrace, letting everything be forgotten. War, the cold, death and suffering. For the moment it was all outside the walls, and she would be content enough to leave it there. There were some things that simply could not be controlled. If war came, then it would come. All she could hope for was that it would not. Elia wasn't sure how long they stood there, embracing one another, but another knock at the door broke them apart. Ned pulled away from her reluctantly and opened the door. A servant girl with mud-brown hair and dress in a simple and rough-spun brown dress was standing there. "Begging your pardons, Lord, Lady. Lord Rickard would like to inform you that he intends to have dinner in his private room tonight, and he would like you to attend him." "Thank you, Maisie, tell him that we will be there." The girl nodded, and Ned shut the door before he turned to face her. "Well, we might get some answers at least. But do not hold your breath," Elia said dryly, and Ned let out a small laugh. Elia turned to check on the children for a moment to make sure that they were both well before she turned back to her husband and walked over to him. "I think I will try and find Ashura, then I will be in our room to change." "Very well, my lady, I intend to do some sparing in the yard. I shall see you tonight." Ned pressed a kiss to her cheek and left her side while Elia went to see if she could find her friend. Alas, it seemed that no matter where she looked she couldn't find her. Lauren was in her room, but with only a nursemaid for company and no sign of her lady mother. The older woman had gone so far as to tell her that Ashura hadn't been to see her in days. A chill of worry warmed up at her spine at that, but she did her best to not let it show, putting a warm smile on her face as she knelt down next to Lauren to play with her for a time. Moving the wooden carving of a wolf to wrap its maw around one of the many limbs of a great wooden kraken, painted in gold and black. She stayed with the girl until she fell asleep, and once she had settled her she told the nursemaid to come and find her if Ashura came into the room at all. She had a horrible feeling that she knew where Ashura was, though she prayed that she was wrong. With every step she took towards her destination, her stomach seemed to tighten more and more. She arrived outside Brandon's room just in time to see the door open and Ashura step out in the hallway. Her lovely violet eyes widened when she saw Elia, but then they fell shut. "I'm sorry. If you're going to apologize, I am the last person it should be too." Elia ran her fingers through her hair, trying to resist the urge to rip it out. She had always thought that Ashura would be smarter than this. Of course, only the people you loved the most could be the ones to disappoint you. You could apologize to Caitlin, seeing as you're sleeping with her husband. Or maybe you should apologize to Lauren, seeing as you are basically ignoring her. Ashura's jaw dropped open and she tried to speak, but all that came out was a noise that sounded like a mix between a sob and a whine, her hand coming up to wipe her tears away. I know. I love him, Elia, I really, truly do. But every time I am with him I feel so guilty, and when I try and spend time with Lauren, I'm reminded how I made her. Guilt's a harsh companion. Elia wanted to reach out and hold her, to tell her that everything would be alright, but she steeled herself against that. Everything was not alright and nothing would be alright unless she was able to do something, and soon. She let out a deep sigh before she spoke again, hardening herself for what she was about to do. Listen to me, clearly you are infatuated with Brandon. If you can't stay with him, then you can remove yourself. Go back to Starfall and take Lauren with you. Ashura stared at her for a moment, as if she didn't recognize her before what she said actually sunk in. Tears fell silently down her face for half a heartbeat before she bent her head. Are you dismissing me from your service, my lady? Elia bit her lip before she answered. No, I am not. I am giving you a chance, a choice. If you want to go back to Starfall, then you have that choice, I can't make it for you. Ashura wiped her tears after a moment before she spoke. I will consider it, my lady. Is there anything else? Elia stared at Ashura, the closest she had ever had to an actual sister, before she spoke again. Go and see your daughter Lauren, and I would consider it a favor to me if you stayed with her tonight. Ashura said nothing but simply nodded and walked past her, Elia reaching up to cover her own eyes once she had gone. After a few moments she took a deep breath and began to make her way to Ned's room. Her husband's room was always one of the coldest in all of Winterfell, and it seemed even Ned was feeling it as of late. As a fire was blazing away in the heath, Elia sat in the chair that had been placed next to it and shut her eyes, trying to focus on calming herself. Everything seemed so hard as of late, and she had to wonder if she had overstepped, if she had lost Ashura. If that was true, then she had lost a part of herself. She wasn't sure how long she had been sitting there, only the sound of the fire crackling in the heath as company, before the door opened and her husband's voice filled her ears. Elia, it's time to go. Did you find Ashura? He asked gently as Elia watched him kneel next to her. Yes, she's with Lauren. It wasn't a lie, she could say that much. She stood up from the chair and realized that she would have to change. She walked over to the trunk that she had moved into Ned's room a short while before they had left Winterfell for that first time. She opened the trunk and picked up a dress of black silk with orange sleeves and laid it down on the bed. From behind her she heard Ned began to undress as she undressed herself, pulling on the new one, and tried to reach behind to button up her dress, but her fingers came just short enough to brush the strings at the back. Ned, I don't want to disturb Ashura, and I don't want to walk through the castle with my bare back on display. Would you mind tying it up? Her husband didn't make a reply, but she soon felt his fingers at her back, brushing over her skin as he tied her dress into place. Elia's eyes slid shut and all her tears and fears faded away when she felt Ned's lips at her neck. Do you really want us to be late for this? Considering it is your father's first dinner since he returned from the south after all. Could we not speak of my father for the moment, my lady? Ned whispered into her ear, his hot breath making her shiver as his arms came to wrap around her middle. But alas, you're right. We shouldn't be late, but I do promise you, my lady, it will be something worth waiting for. The heat in his words made her legs weak and she was certain that if it wasn't for his arms then she would fall to the ground. Ned released his hold and offered her his arm and Elia took it as soon as it was offered. They walked through the long, cold grey corridors of Winterfell until they finally arrived in the Lord's private dining chamber. A guardsman standing at the door opened it for them and the long table beyond was covered with a long white tablecloth, an ivory candlestick holder placed in the middle of it, 4 beeswax candles burning brightly in their holders. Lord Rickard was sitting at the head of the table and in that moment Elia remembered that last time that she had seen him in this room, the same night that he had his heart attack. The thought of that happening again suddenly robbed her of her appetite. The master had said that he had been recovering but he had also not sanctioned him leaving Winterfell and he had only just returned. None of them truly knew what condition that he was in. It seemed as though they were the last to arrive. Lyanna was sitting at her father's right, dressed in white with blue frills at the sleeves. A necklace of sapphires glinted at her pale neck from the light of the candles. Benjen was sitting across from her and dressed in a grey doublet with a silver wolf's head brooch over his breast. Brandon was sitting in between his sister and his wife, holding her hand like he hadn't just been fucking Elia's best friend. Elia wanted to take one of the glasses on the table and smash it full in his face but she held herself back. Kat looked as beautiful as ever. Her hair had been placed into a long braid with blue wildflowers woven through the braid and filling the air with sweetness. Ned and Elia took their places, sitting next to Benjen. As soon as they had sat down serving men came forth and filled their glasses with a golden wine that could only have come from the Arbor. She knew that there were some Arbor golds in the cellars of Winterfell but they were few and far compared to the hundreds and hundreds of barrels of ale. Of course, the return of Lord Rickard was a special enough occasion that she supposed it called for the wine. As soon as their glasses were full, the first meal came out and was placed in front of them. A leek and cabbage and onion soup with 2 crusty black bread rolls to dip into it. Once the serving men left, Lord Rickard reached out and picked up his glass and took a sip of his wine before he spoke. Now, I imagine that you all have some questions for me, yes, Dot? Oh, just a few. Brandon said mockingly before he rubbed his arm after Lyanna laid a heavy slap against his arm but he continued to speak. Let's start with the most obvious one, where did you go? What took you so long to get back? I went south. Oh, south. Well, that just clears everything up. Brandon replied with a roll of his eyes before he spoke again. You went south. It's not like every inch of land from the end of the neck down all the way to the broken arm of Dawn could be considered the south. Father, do you think that I could trouble you to be the tiniest bit more specific? You wanted an answer and I gave you one. If you are unsatisfied with it then I am sorry but that is the only answer that I am prepared to give for the moment. I am returned and all is well for the nonce. Let us not worry about the past any more than is needed. Rickard tore one his bread rolls in half and dipped one of the halves into the soup and popped it into his mouth, chewing and swallowing before he spoke again. I want to know what has been happening in the north since I've been gone. Not much. Brandon muttered as he stared sullenly down at his soup before Lyanna elbowed him again. What Brandon means is that nothing much has happened that's worthy of your attention, father. But Lord Wyman was growing concerned with how long you were away and he was worried that many lords were going to go to White Harbor demanding to see you. Lyanna spoke and Lord Rickard nodded for a moment before he took another sip of his wine. I am aware of that, sweeterling. The Maester was quite able informing me of all that has occurred. If that was true then Elia wasn't sure why he wanted to hear from their mouths what had been happening in his absence. I've spent the day since I arrived back in Winterfell writing letters to all the houses of note, informing them my rest in White Harbor has returned a great deal of strength to me and I have returned to Winterfell to take up my duties as Lord once again. At any rate, as I have returned I think it time for us to speak on your future, all of your futures. Rickard turned to face Lyanna and stared her with his lordly mask completely replacing the one of her father. Lyanna, as soon as the worst of winter has passed us by, I will be sending you south to Storm's End and you will marry Robert Baratheon. He has waited long enough, I think. Lyanna looked like she was about to scream for a moment, to fight and cry and protest as the unfairness of it all, but it only lasted for a moment and Lyanna swallowed painfully and stiffly nodded her head. Yes, father, as you say. Remember the words of our house, Lyanna, winter is coming, it is always coming even when it's here. You are a Stark and you must do your duty. Lord Rickard waited for his daughter to nod again before he turned his attention on to Benjen. Ben, you're not a little boy anymore and soon enough you will be a man grown. With that in mind, I've decided that as soon as the winds warm once again that you will be fostered. The look on the boy's face was enough to make Elia reach across and pull him into a hug, but she knew that she couldn't and she shouldn't. Benjen was well past the age to be fostered. But father, I understand. Lord Stark's face softened for a moment, and when he spoke, his tone was noticeably more gentle. It won't be as bad as all that, Ben. You'll make friends and you'll grow to like it. I mean to foster you in the north. I was thinking of sending you to White Harbor. How does that sound? To his credit, Benjen smiled bravely, though it was a shade tremulous. Ricard nodded, and then his attention turned to Brandon and Catelyn. I will start by saying that I am the Lord of Winterfell, and that won't change until I am in the ground, but I am getting older and the heart attack has left its scars. I am going to need to lean on you, the both of you, from time to time. Brandon, you are going to be the Lord of Winterfell one day, no matter what happens. I need to know that I can depend on you. Brandon said nothing, but he didn't need to, as Catelyn spoke for him, a smile on her face. You can rely on us, good father, I promise you that. Ricard nodded, but his eyes were still locked on Brandon. I am glad to hear that indeed. The time comes for childhood and childish things to be put away. And winter is also a time for leanness. Greed has no place in the north in times such as these. In that moment Elia knew that her good father knew, he had too. She glanced at Ned, and by the frown on his face she knew that he knew that his father knew as well, but it was the look on Brandon's face that made it clear to her that he knew as well. All the arrogance had drained away and all that was left was fear, perhaps for the first time that Elia had seen such a look on his face. If Catelyn knew what Lord Ricard was speaking of, then she did her best not to show it. All she did was rest her hand on her belly and tightened her hold on Brandon's hand, meeting Lord Ricard's gaze fiercely. Lord Ricard quickly broke his gaze and glanced back down at his bowl of soup. So until winter ends, I would say stop getting used to meals such as these. Soon enough it will be meals of salt pork and boiled peas. He took another spoonful of soup into his mouth before he used the over half of his bread roll to soak up more of the soup. Once he had eaten, he turned his gaze onto Ned and Elia, and she knew it was their turn. Ned, you're a man grown yourself, you have a wife and you have children. I trust you. Because of that I have seen fit to have construction begun on a small tower house. It won't be a grand thing, but it will be dry enough. You will have a few tracts of land near the stony shore, and your sons and grandsons will one day build a great castle of their own from that one little tower. Your honor me, father. Ned answered for them both, but Elia did not feel honored. She had grown used to Winterfell. With the hot springs and the pipes she could barely feel winter's chill most days, and on days like this she could have a fire built and wear extra furs over her clothes to make herself warmer, but a tower house wouldn't have any of that, and the stony shore would no doubt be freezing. She could already feel it sleeping into her bones. It was almost as if Lord Ricard had heard her thoughts when he next spoke. I don't mean for either of you to leave Winterfell yet. Most of the building will not even be constructed until we enter the spring. But House Stark needs to grow and to spread, and the two of you both have a part to play in that. I trust you understand. With that there was no more talk. The rest of the dinner sped by quickly. Elia could not remember the other courses they had if she cared enough to try. Her head was filled with too much to think properly. They had found themselves back in Ned's room soon enough, and he was on top of her, in her, and it was as sweet as it always was, but she found that she didn't enjoy it as much as she had. The night's events had spoiled it somewhat. Once Ned had spilled in her, he laid on his side and kissed her neck, love and concern in those soft grey eyes of his. My lady, what's wrong? He asked gently, his hand coming out to smooth down her curls. Every touch gentle, kindness radiating out of every pore. She wanted to tell him nothing was wrong, but she had already lied to him once this day. She didn't want to do it again. The truth was, everything seemed to be going wrong at the moment, and she did not know who to tell, what to say, what to do. Doran would know, Oberyn would know as well. And in that moment, Elia Martell knew what she needed. There was a raven from Dorne, my brother. Oberyn. She pointed out once she saw the look on Ned's face. It was a personal letter, speaking of my nieces and news from Dorne itself and how they had heard about the boy's birth, offering us our congratulations and an invitation to take the boys to Dorne to go and see them, to introduce them to the twins. She already knew that she was fighting an uphill battle when she saw Ned stand up from the bed, walking to stand in front of the window, his naked back to her. Firm muscles under his skin painted by the orange light of the fire. The last time we went south, you were stolen away by a mad king's foolishness. His voice sounded heavy, conflicted. Elia sat up in bed and pulled the furs closer to her. Even with the fire it was still too cold in here. My brothers are not the king. You've met Oberyn and I know for a fact you'll like Doran. I wouldn't ask, but it might be the last chance that I have to see Dorne. I would like you to see Dorne. I would consider it a favor to me, my love, and not one I'd forget. Ned turned back to face her and walked back to the bed. He laid down and caught her lips in a kiss. He pulled back, but he still held her face in his hands. I'd prefer to ask my father first, if he gives consent. Then I imagine that we could take a ship from White Harbor. Elia smiled brightly and kissed Ned again. She knew it wasn't a yes, but she knew that Ned wasn't against it. As for her good father, well, she imagined that Lord Ricard would be able to find a way to make a visit to Dorne advantageous. He seemed to have quite a talent at that. And when Elia rested against her husband's chest, her eyes sliding shut, she dreamed of golden sands and blue seas. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50. 1,000 candles twinkled at the feet of the mother and near as many as the feet of the father. There were hundreds at the altar of the smith, the crone, the warrior and the maid, and even now 100 burned at the feet of the stranger. Incense hung thick in the air, so sweet that it coated the back of his throat with every breath that Roriger took. Sir Harlan Grandison almost looked handsome, crowned in his scaled white armor as he lay on the bier. Death had robbed him of the last 20 years of age, and for the first time, Roriger could say that he looked nearly young. Peaceful, he looked peaceful. He wondered if he would look like this when he died. He hoped that he would, but somehow he had doubted it. The only other person in the September at the moment was the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, who had taken it upon himself to stand the last vigil for the old knight. Sir Gerald Hightower was resplendent in his white scale armor, a large white helm enclosed his head, and he stood as still and silent as a statue. Roriger didn't have anything to say to him. He wouldn't disturb the peace that had fallen onto the September. His mother had come earlier with all her ladies in attendance and Viserys clutching at her skirts. They had each lit a candle and had laid them at the feet of the mother's statue, and all of them had knelt in prayer. The silk hoods that they wore shimmering in the candle light, their soft prayers almost sounding like a lullaby as a son was sung to sleep. Many lords and ladies and knights had all come to pay their respects, even those who had never met the old man before. Even his father had come to the September as well, for the first time in years actually coming out of the Red Keep. He had stayed in his litter all the way up to the door of Baela's September and had the rest of his King's Guard guarding it all the way. And yet when he had seen the old man who had served his father for decades, the king looked even more fragile than usual. For a brief moment he thought that his father might actually weep, but as soon as it had appeared the madness clouded his face once again, and glanced at every lord and lady in the September, trying to find any enemies and not knowing that all he was doing was making them instead. And yet now the Septa was empty. Only a few Septons with censers were inside the September along with Roriger and Sir Gerald. Night had fallen on them and he knew that he should return to the Red Keep, and yet he hadn't wanted to go back just yet. Sir Harlan had been dear to him as he had been growing, and the man deserved as much respect as he could give. It had been so sudden. Everyone knew that Sir Harlan was an old man and wouldn't likely have been long for the world, but how quickly he had slipped away had been odd. Arthur had spoken about how he had been falling asleep more and more often in meetings in the Sword Tower of the Red Keep, and it often them to shaking him in his bed to get him to wake up, until one day, they couldn't wake him no matter what they had tried. Roriger had to wonder if dying in his sleep would have pleased him. It was certainly peaceful, but at the same time, a knight was meant to die fighting. The sound of footsteps entering the hall and approaching the bier made Roriger look up from Sir Harlan's face to see his lady wife approaching the bier. Even when dressed in the colors of mourning, Cersei was still stunningly beautiful. She wore a dress of black samite. Only a few golden swirls on the sleeves were the only color that she wore at the moment. Her golden curls framed her hair, being free of a hairnet. Her belly was alive with their child, and the dress had to be taken out accordingly. She was so beautiful. She stood next to him and wrapped her hands around his arm and rested her head against his shoulder. "I was worried for you when you did not return with the others." Her voice was gentle, barely above a whisper as she looked down at the knight. "It saddens me that I missed the service." Did the Septon speak well? Well enough, for a man who did not truly know him. The Septon had been dressed plainly, well, as plainly as a member of the most devout could. They had still not chosen a new High Septon as, according to Varys, they were terrified of offending the king. When Varys had told them that in the middle of the small council meeting, Roriger's royal father had only smiled. It was still a matter of great concern, for so long as there was no High Septon then the faith was technically leaderless. Leadership had fallen to the most devout in the High Septon's absence and they normally had an election among their own numbers to choose who would ascend to the position, but apparently this election had been calmer than others. No one seemed willing to step into the robes that had caused the previous High Septon to be burned alive. The thought of the stench of his roasting flesh was enough to make him feel ill, so he resolved to shove the memory of it, and all the consequences that had risen with it, to the back of his mind for the moment before he pressed a kiss to the top of Cersea's head, his wife letting out a pleased little hum. "And you, my love? Are you well now?" The morning before they were to set out, an attack of violent sickness had stricken his lady wife and had forced her to be confined to her privy until the attack had cleared up. It was only when he thought of it that Roriger noticed that she was looking quite a bit paler than normal. At the time he had simply thought that it had been due to the black gown that she was wearing. The memory of it seemed to displease his wife as she frowned heavily and stiffened ever so slight. "A bit, Grand Maester Pycelle has been very helpful." He was a bit concerned. "It's rare for sickness to strike this late, but he claims that all will be well so long as I have a deal of bed rest." Cersei pulled away from him and walked to the top of the bier, so she could look down to Sir Harlan's face. A look of contemplation appeared on her face as she stared down at him. "You know who I feel the most sorry for, at the moment?" she asked, not removing her gaze from the old knight's peaceful face. "Who?" "His squire." Cersei answered as she looked up at him. The lights of the candles caught her eyes and made the deep green pools glow. She stepped back towards him and reached down to take his hand, placing it on her belly. "What's his name, my love?" "I cannot remember on the top of my head." In truth, Roriger didn't know it either. He had seen the boy, though calling him a boy was something of a disservice as he was closer to 20 and thus older than a squire should be, about the Red Keep and King's Landing, often sent on some errand by Sir Harlan that was oft pointless as many of the men he had been sent to find had moved on from the city or had been dead for years. The boy was short but stocky, dark hair framed a slightly pudgy face with droopy eyes which was oft bearded. It was odd how he could recall his features easily enough and yet the name seemed to have slipped from his memory. He turned to Sir Gerald. "Lord Commander, forgive me, but do you know the name of Sir Harlan's squire?" "Meryn, my prince. His name is Meryn, of the House Trant." That was it. The voice of the Lord Commander being muffled by his helm gave his words an almost booming quality. "He has been serving, forgive me my prince, he had been serving as Sir Harlan's squire since he was 8 years old. He is past 20 now. As far as I am aware no squire in service to a Kingsguard knight has ever had to wait so long to be knighted himself." "That is what I was thinking of, how sad it all was. This poor man has been in service to Sir Harlan for years, and I do not mean to speak ill of the poor dear man, but we all know that squiring for him must have been difficult. And now he has lost his chance to be knighted. Who would take on a 20-year-old squire?" his wife asked as her hand came up to cup Roriger's cheek. The feel of her gentle touch against his cheek light a fire in him. "The thought of it tears my gentle heart all to pieces. My love, knight him. He may never get the chance to do so otherwise." It was an odd request, some would even call it a daring one. Still others would call it rude and impertinent. Cersei was his lady wife and a princess, and yet she would never be able to be a knight. She truly couldn't understand the duties and responsibilities that came with it. Yet others would call it inappropriate for the man to be knighted now since the knight he had been serving had only just died. And yet the thought of it was sweet and she meant no harm, and he imagined the squire must have been feeling terrible at the moment. When all that was considered, it was hard to deny her, and thus she granted the request with a smile. He would knight Meryn on the morrow, and for the rest of time, he would always be known as Sir Meryn. The smile she granted with him was one that could outshine the sun. "Thank you, my lord." She leaned up and pressed a kiss to his lips before she pulled away. "I mean to return to the Red Keep. Will my lord accompany me?" Roriger thought for a moment before he nodded and asked Cersei to wait in the litter for a moment. Once his wife had left the September, he turned his attention back onto Sir Gerald. "Are you sure that you will be all right to continue the vigil for the rest of the day?" Sir Gerald nodded and informed him that Sir Luwin would be reliving him and taking over the vigil on the morrow. Roriger left the September after lighting another candle at the feet of the father and another at the feet of the crone and saying a quick prayer to the both of them, hoping that the father would judge that Sir Harlan deserved a place in the finest of the 7 heavens and that the crone would give him the wisdom to know what to do and what actions he should take in all the battles were to come. Roriger soon found himself in his wife's litter, and as they were on their way back to the Red Keep, a heavy rain began to fall down onto them. Roriger watched as the rain fell while Cersei was attending to some needlework. The prince allowed himself to enjoy a few moments of mindlessness before Cersei's voice brought him back to the moment. "I imagine that there will soon be a new white sword to fill the place of the old." Roriger frowned slightly as he contemplated that. It throw out a brand new set out outcomes. A new white brother could be blessing or a curse to him. Most in the 7 kingdoms knew what his father was, so it was more than possible that he would be able to convince them to side with him when he had need of them, but at the same time the sort of men who would swear the vows of the Kingsguard were those who wouldn't be easily swayed by the ways he would be able to sway most. He had been able to convince Arthur Dayne and Luwin Martell. Neither of them were fond of the king after what he had done to Aela and her husband, but they were also good men who had seen the horrors that his father had inflicted, and since he had been sent to Dragonstone with them he had been able to convince Sir Oswell to come over to his side as well, which he was more than pleased with, as his family's seat of Harrenhal could come in handy. But a new Kingsguard could complicate matters more than a slight bit. Roriger had no say or even influence in who was chosen, and even if he did have some, it was more than likely that his father would just ignore all that he said, as he more than often seemed to do. "I imagine that there will be, yes. My father will more than likely wait some time as to be respectful to Sir Harlan's passing, and there are many worthy knights in the 7 kingdoms. It will take even more time to decide who is worthy of the honor." The answer seemed to satisfy his lady wife as she returned to her needlework, a small smile playing on her lips. Roriger turned his attention back onto the rain as the litter made its way back up to the Red Keep. Its walls darkened to the color of blood. End of Chapter 50. Chapter 51. The sun bearing down on him was relentless, and at the moment, there was nothing that he wanted more than a skinful of cool water or even some sweet wine. The deck of the ship swayed slightly, and the uneasy feeling it caused in his stomach made him want to run over to the side and release the contents of his stomach into the waiting waters below. But Ned managed to keep control even as the sun continued its assault on him and made his head feel light and made it hard to think. How any man could stand this relentless heat made no sense to him. Elia on the other hand seemed brighter than he had ever seen her. She had spent a great deal of time since they had taken ship from White Harbor out on the deck, more and more energetic as the air began to turn warmer and drier. In their cabin, she sung to their sons in a tongue that he did not recognize. Apparently it was an old Rhoynish river song that had been passed down from when Nymeria had begun her voyage to Dorne, and it had been taught to Elia by a companion that she had at Sunspear when she had been a girl who had been an orphan of the green blood, who were apparently some of the only Rhoynar in all of Dorne who had never wed with the Andals or the First Men. The song itself had been sweet and sad. Elia had told him that it was about a young girl whose father and brothers had been killed during the Rhoynar defending themselves against the Valyrians, and wondering what she would do now and what new land awaited for her as the ship sailed away from the Mother Rhoyne for the last time. Speaking of the boys, for fairly young babes, neither of them seemed to have much complaint against the heat as he did. It was clear to him that in this, they had taken after their mother. It shouldn't really have surprised Ned, considering how hot Elia often kept their nursery. They were used to almost constant heat. It did make him wonder somewhat how they, and Elia, would fare when they were placed inside a tower house on the stony shore. It was a great honor, and Ned knew that he was a great deal luckier than most second sons. Most would often just serve as knights in their elder brother's garrison, and if they served well in time then perhaps they might be granted a few tracts of land to build their own tower. To have a tower built for you to start with was a great honor. Still, despite that luck, it would not have the ability to pump heat through its walls. Before he had truly known Elia, before she had even come north, Ned remembered how everyone used to speak of the poor fragile, delicate Dornish princess. Elia wasn't fragile, he was one of the strongest women that he had ever known. Not a man's strength at arms perhaps, though now that such a great deal of time had passed since and so much had happened, he could look back at the memory of his tiny wife beating his sister in a sword fight with good humor. But she was strong in a different way. A way he didn't think that he could be. But at the same time, he had seen the signs of her illness. She had told him herself that when she had been a girl her sickness had been oftentimes been so great that she was forced to stay away from the rest of the children and be confined to her room by the maester who served House Martell until she regained her strength, which often took between days and weeks for her to fully recover. For as long as she had been in the north, The worst Ned had ever seen her was after her fight with Lionel, and she had fainted. Ned remembered how angry he had been at Lionel at the time, how terrified he had been for his lady wife, and that was also when he realized that he had actually, at some point, fallen in love with her. When terror had sunk its claws into its heart as he had watched her fall to the ground. How else could you ever know, other than when it was risked being taken from you forever? It had taken her nearly a day and a half to come back into the world of the living, and through all that time, Ned had not left her side. When he wasn't with her, either Ashura or the Maester were instead. That had been the worst that he had ever personally seen her, but after she had borne the boys in White Harbor when she returned from her captivity at Casterly Rock, none had been able to wake her from a deep sleep that fell on her, and they had to feed her with honey and water. She was still weak when Ned had arrived with his father, and it took her weeks before she was well enough to even attempt to make the journey back to Winterfell, and even then, only in a litter with a dozen furs covering her. But she had seemed stronger at Winterfell as of late. But Winterfell was Winterfell, and White Harbor was warmer than most seats in the north due to being closer to the south and the sea. The Stony Shore was a different matter. It lived up to its name, with beaches made up of nothing but an endless waste of grey round pebbles, some as small as a peach pit and others as large as a small ball. The tide came in quick and sharp, sending spray everywhere and filling the winds with scent of salt, and the wind itself was cold and went through a man with a knife. Ned would be able to handle it. He was a Northman, and Lyra and Brandon were always quick to tease that he had ice water in his veins instead of blood, but Elia was a woman of summer and the babes were young. The Stony Shore would be cold for even a Northman, and even a tower house would be cold. Fires would need to be built every day to keep them warm. Well, if that was what it took, then that was what he would do. Ned swallowed deeply as he felt his stomach began to settle, taking a few moments to catch his breath before he made his way back to the cabin, leaving the door open as he stepped inside to try and make it a little less warm. Elia was watching the boy sleep, and her smile grew when she saw him come in. "Did the captain say where we were? I can't imagine that we will be far now." They had taken ship on a Lysan trading vessel that had Planky Town as its destination on its way back to Essos. The captain of that was a man that Ned didn't think whose like he would ever meet again, with his copper skin and white hair and colorful silks and extravagant way of dressing with colorful silks and plum-feathered caps. "Soren said we should be pulling into Planky Town within the hour." "Good." Ayla's smile could outshine the sun above, and at that moment, Ned realized that he could endure the heat and 1,000 times worse. "Then we should be at Sunspear by midday. I cannot wait for you to see it, my lord. Winterfell has its beauty as well, of course, but I promise you, there is nowhere like Sunspear in all of the world. I shall trust your judgment on that, my lady." He walked across the cabin and poured himself a cup of ice-cold water from the flagon. Though he wished to drink straight from the flagon itself, he managed to restrain himself. He finished the first cup in a matter of seconds and poured himself another one. "Forgive me, my lady, but is it always this hot?" Elia stared at him for a moment as though she didn't understand the question, blinked and then answered. "It's actually quite cool for dawn. It is still winter after all." Ned imagined it was the look on his face that made his lady wife laugh at him. "Worry not, my love, we shall not stay in Dawn long, I should think. Just for my brothers to meet their nephews and for you to meet them. We shall be back in the north to enjoy the last few long moons of winter, in our new tower house of our own, dining on pinecone and pebble soup. Nothing wrong with pinecone soup, not sure about the pebbles, but they might add some texture." A smile was his token for the jest, and Ned sat next to her on the bed, pressing a kiss to her cheek. Elia laid her head on his shoulder as he began to speak. "And tower houses grow and expand and become holdfasts and keeps in time. A second son of House Stark, Carlon, was given a tower house and a few tracts of land as reward for leal service. His tower grew, became known as Carl's Hold, and then the Carl Hold Starks became known as the Carstarks, becoming a noble house in their own right. What shall our holdfast be known as, do you think? What will our noble house be known as when we are nothing but bones and dust?" Her voice sounded far away, almost tired. It had been the first time he had heard her so melancholy sounding since they had taken ship. Ned brought up his round to run his fingers through Elia's hair, and Ned felt his wife lean into the touch and into him. "Ned's Hold. Eddard's Hold. And have our future noble house be called the Edstarks. The Ned Starks. I think our several times great-grandchildren would dig up my bones and throw them into the bogs of the neck as punishment for that, or maybe throw them to the dogs to save on the journey." Elia laughed at that and Ned smiled before pressing a kiss to the top of her head. The Shoresticks. The Stonesticks. The Stonesticks, I like that. When we get back to the north, we should call our new Holdfast Stonehold. It was as fine a name as any that he could come up with, but he said nothing, merely listened to his wife as he spoke. And there will be a large heath with a fire always burning, we don't want it to be too cold. A few grey dogs that chew on bones in front of it. Some hand-carved wooden chairs to sit in and bowls of pinecone soup. Sounds wonderful if you ask me. And it did, he could think of anything better. Nice and peaceful and as warm as they could be, with a happy small folk. But alas, like most things in life as of late, Ned doubted that it would be that simple. But that is for the morrow, my love, or the morrow after it. Let us focus on today for now, and you can show me all the wonder of dawn. Elia nodded, and soon enough a crewman knocked on the cabin wall and called down that they were approaching the dock. They climbed onto the deck with Moors in Elia's arms and Torrin in Ned's. Both boys were still asleep. It seemed that they also didn't have trouble sleeping on a ship as their father did. He envied them that, as he hadn't had a good night's sleep since they had boarded the boat. When Ned saw the port, he couldn't deny that he was surprised at what he saw. It didn't look like much of a port at all. It looked simply like a group of barges had been tethered together at the mouth of a river which he had to assume was the Green Blood. It didn't look like a ship the size of the Lion ship would be able to find any harbor there, and thus they would have to be put on a smaller ship to be rowed across. 2 ships went ahead first with most of the goods packed aboard chests, with the rest to go ashore later. Ned and Elia were to go ahead on the next one, but only after he had given the captain the payment. The man had kissed him on both cheeks and patted him on the back and wished them both the best of fortune. Ned was almost completely certain he would never meet a man like Salad Horsaran ever again. They walked across the wooden walkway that all of the barges were tethered to before Elia stopped and ducked into one. Ned raised an eyebrow before he followed her inside. The inside of the barge had been made into a tavern. It was cramped and the air was filled with strange scents, but Elia did not seem to notice as she strode through. If anyone in the barge was surprised by the sight of a noble woman with a babe in her arms in their tavern, then they did not show it. They did seem slightly more surprised at him, however. Ned held Torrin tight and followed after his wife. A rotund woman with grey hair and a patch over her eye looked up from the wine stain she was trying to scrub out, letting out a cry of delight at the sight of Elia. "Princess, oh, you are sight for my sore eye, you are." She ran around the long plank placed on top of barrels that served as a bar and, most incredibly of all, embraced her like she was her daughter. "How beautiful you are, oh, and this little one. He's your son." "Yes, Yula, my baby." "Well, one of them." Elia gestured for Ned to come closer and she gestured at Torrin. "He's Torrin and this is Moors, but that's not why I'm here." "Torrin knew I was coming, but he wouldn't know when, could you?" "Of course, princess." Yula ran back around the bar and picked up a large silver bell and a wooden spoon. She hit the bell hard and a low ring filled the barge, which got the attention of all of the people and made them look up from their drinks. Sadly, it also woke Moors from his slumber, and the babe began to wail in his unhappiness, which alas woke his brother and set him off as well. Yula looked as though she had just been told that she was about to lose her other eye, but Elia was quick to soothe her before moving to soothe their children. Once all the sadness was forgotten, with only a few straight hairs to act as a reminder, the woman spoke. "Right then, listen up, your lot. Ride up to Sunspear and tell the princes that their sister is here. Whoever gets there first gets half year's worth of free wine." Ned was certain that a stampede of rampaging Aurochs would have been a more peaceful exit. Only 1 or 2 older patrons were left in the bar, and Yula gestured for them to follow her into a small back room which had been made out of a private cabin in the barge. A few strange trinkets and charms decorated the room, and another scent filled the air, but this one was less heavy and more sweet, and Ned could almost convince his nostrils that he enjoyed the smell. They took seats at a small round table, and Yula reached out to pick up a flagon from the middle of the table and quickly filled 3 cups. "I was keeping this for something special. And you coming to see me is special enough, considering that you didn't come and see me before you went to freeze beyond the mountains." "I'm sorry, Yula, I meant to come and see you, but everything happened in such a rush." Elia didn't take her cup as she made sure that Moors was safely settled in her arms before she spoke again. "At any rate, this my husband. Eddard of the House Stark, Ned my love. This is Yula of the Orphans, who served as a maid in Sunspear since my great-grandfather's day and was nursemaid for me and Oberyn." "A pleasure, my lady." The old woman laughed at that, one full of life. No lady me my lord. Never have been one, just a woman with a tavern. Another laugh escaped from Ulla before she turned her attention back to Elia. So then, how you've been since you left for the North, princess? Everything been all right? Not too cold? Ned turned his attention once Elia and Ulla fell into conversation. His eyes ran over all the trinkets on the walls. He also bounced Torren every now and then to make sure that the babe was properly settled. It seemed that more time had passed than he had realized as there was a knock on the cabin door, and when Ulla opened it, one of the old men said that someone had come for the princess. Elia let go of the old woman, kissing both of her cheeks like she was her mother, before following Ned out of the barge. Waiting for them at the end of the wooden walkway were 20 men, all of them dressed in copper armor and orange silk, spears strapped across their backs and shields on their arms with the vigil of House Martell blazing on them, the copper of the shields shining as bright as the sun. The leader of the men, tall for a Dornish man with broad shoulders, leapt off of his horse and strode towards them. Elia let out a cry of delight when his dark face stepped into view. "Cousin!" she cried out before rushing to meet him. The man embraced her, taking care not to crush Mors, and held her for a moment. Elia pulled away, the both of them laughing. "Ned, my love. May I introduce Sir Mamfrey Martell, my dearest cousin and Castellan of Sunspear. Mamfrey, my husband and my sons. I wasn't expecting you to come and get me." Mamfrey shook his head, grinning before he ran his fingers through his dark curls. "Well, your brothers wanted to make sure that you got back to Sunspear safely. Oberyn wanted to send 100 guards, Doran wanted to send 10 and Arrow Hotter. I eventually got them to compromise. A pleasure to meet you, Lord Eddard. How are you enjoying Dorne?" A part of him wanted to say that at least for the moment he hadn't been enjoying Dorne at all. It was hot and dry and he already wanted to have something else to drink, and as the sun kept beating down on him he also wanted to strip himself off his clothes and throw himself into the sea, but he imagined that he shouldn't say any of that. "Dorne has been most hospitable, sir. I am most eager to meet my good brothers and to see Sunspear itself. And I know that they are eager to meet you, my lord, and see their newest nephews." Sir Mamfrey ducked his finger to tickle Mors under his chin, filling the air with his cries of delight. "We knew that you had the babes, so the wheelhouse is waiting." It was certainly one of the strangest litters that Ned had ever seen. It was small even compared to some of the most modest that he had ever seen, looking like at most it could perhaps hold only half a dozen people. In terms of design it was similar to the one that had brought his lady wife to the north, but unlike that one, it looked like someone had cut it in half, meaning their bodies would be exposed to the elements. Well, as it was Dorne he imagined that it would truly only be the one element. Attached to the front of the wheelhouse were 2 pure white horses with golden manes. They were smaller than most horses, but Ned had to assume that they were the famous sand steeds of Dorne that could ride for days and nights with only a mouthful of water. He wondered briefly if his father should consider arranging a match between House Ryswell and a Dornish house that was renowned for the breeding of sand steeds. They might learn from one another and perhaps breed sand steeds that were as large as a regular horse. One of the Martell guardsmen opened the small door for the wheelhouse and Elia stepped inside, Ned giving her Torren once she had settled Mors on the floor next to a small mound of cushions. A brief parting kiss and Ned was led over to a free sand steed which had been brought for him to ride. Ned had been riding fully grown stallions since he had been 12, and while a sand steed wasn't, he had to admit that once he had saddled it he did feel partly that he was riding a pony. Sir Mamfrey rode over to him and handed him a square of fabric. At the raised eyebrow Ned gave him the Martell Knight was quick to explain. "Wrap it around your face and cover your mouth. It's unlikely this close to the castle, but if we get hit by a sandstorm then it will keep the worst of it out of your mouth and keep the sun off your head." "My thanks," Ned said as he wrapped the fabric around his head. It seemed to make the heat worse, but the Dornish knew how to endure their land better than he did, and thus he followed their lead. Sir Mamfrey nodded his approval once he had seen him finish before he rode on next to the litter and handed a few other squares of fabric down to Elia, who deftly put one around her own face but did not give the boys one. Ned knew that she had been terrified of them choking on a bit of fabric when they were in their cradles, and thus he decided to trust her judgment. The ride was more enjoyable than he had been expecting. He had never ridden a horse on sand before, but the steed seemed to know where he was going, and the old master of horse at Winterfell, when his grandfather had been the lord and before Hullen had taken the post, had always told him that the horse knew that ground better than the man who rode them, and it was best to give them trust. Dorne had its own beauty in its way. It had none of the fertile valleys of the Vale, the never-ending meadows of the reach or even the great forests and hidden coves, but the sands looked like gold in the light of the sun, and the few tiny streams throughout the desert were oases of green, the water shining like silver. But even now, Ned couldn't deny that he longed to be back in the north, to breathe in the cold air that could only come in the morning, and to look out on the moors with a cup of hot spiced wine, some venison stew and black bread still hot from the ovens. But Winterfell would still be there, waiting for him and his wife and his children. Elia had wanted to come to Dorne, and he could not deny her that. Perhaps Dorne would grow on him as the north had grown on her. Dusk was falling on the land when they began to reach the outskirts of Sunspear. His lady wife had not been expecting to have to wait for the guards to come to them when she had said that they should be there by midday, but that didn't matter. They were here. He had to admit, it was impressive. In truth, Sunspear was actually slightly smaller than Winterfell, and the Shadow City that clung to its walls didn't look much larger than Winter's Town. The Shadow City itself seemed to have buildings made of mud and sandstone, while Winter's Town buildings were made of stone and timber and straw. But then it occurred him that the buildings of the north were built to keep the cold out, while these were meant to let it in. However, the most striking thing that he could see even from as far away as they were was that a dozen long and narrow towers rose up into the air, made of white stone and topped with gold. The longest grew more and more narrowed towards the top, with a long golden spire reaching up into the sky. The one next to it was shorter, but it had a great dome of gold at the top. If he had to guess, and from what his wife had told him, he was looking at the Tower of the Spear and the Tower of the Sun. Sir Mamfrey cried for the threefold gate to be opened as they rode through the Shadow City and approached the first wall. The great wooden gates swung open, as did the two pairs of gates behind it. The inside of the wall seemed more like a city, to be truthful, with noisy bazaars and large courts with fountains, and indeed, it seemed at a glance, more people. They rode through the next pair of gates and soon reached the keep of House Martell, the stronghold at the heart of Sunspear. Ned leapt from his horse and rubbed at his legs as one of their escort held the door open and Elia stepped out, both of their babes asleep in her arms. They walked into the inner courtyard and came to a stop once they saw the welcoming party. Prince Doran was standing. Although he did lean on a carved wooden stick, he was at least a decade older than his brother and his sister. He shared his black eyes, black curls and dark olive skin with both of them. Once he saw Elia and the babes, a warmth seemed to fill him. The woman standing next to him was who he had to assume was Prince Doran's wife. She was beautiful, her features delicate and her head bare with rings of gold encircling her long and narrow neck. At their feet were two children, a girl who was the elder with dark olive skin and curls, and a boy who was younger with his curls falling into his eyes. Oberyn was a familiar and welcome sight, dressed in silk robes of orange, red, yellow and gold. He almost looked to be a fire made flesh. Oberyn was standing next to him, and she had grown since Ned had last saw her. If he had to estimate, then she was about an inch taller than Lyanna. Nymeria stood next to her sister, dressed in lilac and seafoam silk, a golden snake encircling her arm. Little Tyon was holding on to her father's arm, dressed in a gown of pure white. Ned had to take a moment when she realized that Oberyn's other arm was full with a little girl, barely more than a babe. She was as black as ink and her curls were as dark as her father's, but her eyes were the brown of warm honey. Doran approached them then, his stick clicking against the ground as he moved towards them. "Sweet sister." He embraced Elia deeply, holding on to her tightly before pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You are as always, a sight for sore eyes and weary hearts. And indeed, these must be my nephews." A hand came out to gently cup Torrhen's cheek before he bent down to press a kiss to his forehead before doing the same to Mor's. "Thank you." Elia spoke as tears welled in her cheeks, Doran quick to wipe them away before he walked to stand in front of Ned. Ned was taller than the prince by half a head, and yet, for all the frailness that the stick he required to help him walk implied, Ned sensed that he had a strength in him as well. An authority that could only come with years and years of being raised to rule. "Well, I won't deny that I was not sure what to expect when I arranged for you to marry my sister, Lord Eddard. According to everywhere north of the mountains, those north of the neck are nothing but savage barbarians who open the throats of babes and animals and feed their blood to their tree gods." Ned felt something that might have been anger curling in their gut, but before it could truly set in, Prince Doran let out a laugh. "But then, according to those north of the mountains, our women are wanton and our men are wild and care for naught but blood. I think we should take their opinions with a grain of salt, don't you?" That had soothed the anger, quelling it like a hot forged blade plunged into water, and Ned nodded with a smile. I quite agree, my prince. He nodded towards the keep before he spoke again. You have a fine keep, my prince. If I may say so, we have nothing like it in the north. Thank you, Lord Eddard, we are quite fond of it as well. Prince Doran spoke with an easy smile before he beckoned forward his wife, who strode across the courtyard with long as easy strides, the children following after her. May I introduce my lady wife, Melorio of the Free City of Norphos. My daughter and heir, the Princess Ariane, and my son, Prince Quentin. Melorio gave him polite greetings in the thick accents of the East. Quentin, who didn't seem much older than his own son, stared up at him with wide eyes for a moment before he turned his attention to the rag doll in his hands. Princess Ariane stared at him for a shorter moment before she performed a curtsy. The hospitality of Sunspear is yours, Lord Stark. A small chuckle escaped from Ned's mouth as knelt in front of the girl as Elia pressed kisses to Melorio's cheeks and leaned down to show their sons to Quentin before Ned spoke to the girl. Thank you, my princess, your hospitality is most welcome after our long and perilous journey. But I must inform you that my father is Lord Stark, please call me Ned. If this is agreeable to you, and please know that any service you would ask of me, ask, and I will see it done. Ariane stared at him for a moment before she giggled and ran over to Tyon, taking her hand and whispering something into her ear. He supposed that could have gone worse. Oberyn came forward with the new girl in his arms and Oberyn and Nymeria following behind him. Well, it's been a while and much has happened, brother, but you don't seem to have melted at all. And I imagine, my prince, that if you ever came to the north, you would find it in yourself to not turn into an ice cube. Oberyn laughed at that and Elia sighed as she came closer to look at the babe in her brother's arms. Oh, Oberyn. Another one. Another one. What can I say, my dear sister, there is so much of the world to savor and I am not one to refuse to partake in it. A ship from the Summer Isles came in carrying silk, spice and this little beauty. Oberyn placed a kiss to the top of the girl's head and spoke with a gentleness that Ned would not have expected from him. Say hello to your auntie, Sarala. The girl stared at Elia for only a moment before she let out a whimper and buried her face into her father's chest, clinging to him tightly. Elia sighed and reached out to run her fingers through her dark hair after she had handed both of the boys over to Melorio and Doran to hold for the nonce. Never mind, my love, there will be time enough for all of that later. The mother. She was the captain of the ship and she doesn't stay in one port for anything longer than a fortnight. She went to Pentos to give birth and only went there during the last few weeks. She tried for her, to be fair. But she came to the conclusion that ship life is no place for a babe and has thus decided to bring her to me. She did mention that she may come visit her at times and I saw no reason to refuse her that. Fair enough. Elia said before she pressed a kiss to the girl's crown once again. Ned had to wonder if any woman of the Riverlands or the Reach or the Crownlands or the Stormlands or the Westerlands or even from the north would be so accepting of her brother bringing home another bastard. Well, even if she did disapprove, it didn't matter. The girl was here now. Doran, might we unpack and refresh for the night? Of course, I mean to hold a feast to celebrate your arrival and the fact that I am an uncle twice over. I will see you then, Mel, would you please attend me? Hotter. The large man with an equally large axe slammed the butt of it down on the ground and followed his prince and his prince's lady into the keep. Oberyn fell into a low bow and followed his brother into the keep, his daughters following after him. Sir Mamfrey ordered his men to take their posts and took it upon himself to lead them through the bright and airy corridors of the keep and up a set of stairs into a large room. He made his farewells and soon enough it was just Ned, Elia and their sons. Someone had taken the foresight of having some cradles set up in the room and Elia placed both boys down before she went to lay down on her bed. So, what did you think of them? They seem noble and kind and as wonderful as you told me that they would be. Ned went to lay down next to her, his fingers brushing through her hair. Was it good to see them? It was, though I must admit. It surprised me to see Melorio and my brother in the same place. That made Ned frown and Elia spoke again. My brother and his wife, well. They aren't able to see as much of one another as they would both like to. Again, that made little sense to him. They were wed, why wouldn't they be able to see one another as much? At any rate, Ned was not about to question it. It's a shame Ashura didn't come with us, she could have seen her family. They must miss her. Elia's voice sounded far away and Ned's hand came out to stroke her cheek, her dark eyes met his own. Ashura made her choice, it doesn't reflect on you. She's my lady, I should have ordered her to come with me. You didn't and it's done, don't worry about it now. You came because you missed your brothers, your nieces. And now, you've got a new one. Enjoy the sun while it lasts. Elia let out a laugh at that and pressed a kiss to his cheek. When did my lord get so wise? My love, would you believe the day I married you? End of chapter 51. Chapter 52. Once, a very long time ago, a humble knight with a humble name was wandering the red mountains of Dawn, hoping to find some holdfast where he might swear his sword. He would sleep in caves and under the few trees that grew there, breaking his fast on the lemons and figs that grew on them in the morning, and would stare up at the star-filled sky at night. On those nights, he saw 1,000 different colors that men would have no names for, and for some to this day they still would not. But one night, no different than any other night, as the man lay himself on the warm ground and waited for sleep to claim him, he saw a star falling through the night sky. It was a sliver light that blazed through the sky and seemed to leave a trail that would never fade. As the knight watched it fall through the night sky, he knew that he had to follow it to the end of the world and beyond, if that was what was required. Thankfully, he didn't quite have to go that far. The star had landed on an island in the middle of the mouth of the great river Torrentine, burning in the middle of a great pit. Its flames were silver and the smoke was clear. In the smoke and the light, a woman appeared. Her hair was a wildfire and her eyes were moonstones. From her breast she pulled out a great sword and gestured for the knight to kneel. Once the man had knelt before her, the Lady of the Light pressed the sword blade to both of his shoulders. The steel of the blade cut through his cloth and leather and bite into his skin, and yet he had never known a sweeter kiss from a maid. As the sun rose, the Lady of Light decreed that night the sword of the morning, and she faded away with the dawn, but not before she charged him with building a seat and becoming the greatest knight of them at all. And then, hundreds of days and hundreds of nights he labored. He built a great castle of white stone, with a long tower that overlooked the sea, to see all enemies who could come and threaten Dawn, those who would kill its men, burn its castles and keeps and hold fasts. Soon they named themselves kings, only forsaking the title when Nymeria landed. And to this day, Starfall still stands, and the same sword that the Lady of Light produced from her breast continued to be passed down through the ages, not to the eldest son, but to whoever proved themselves the equal of that first knight, worthy of the title of the Sword of the Morning. Could I be the Sword of the Morning, Mama? Lauren asked as she stared up at her with her soft grey eyes, her cloth princess doll held tightly in her little arms. Can I defend all of Dawn? Ashura smiled down at her. Her little girl had brought her more joy than she knew that she had any right to. She reached out to push one of her curls back behind her ear. You can go back to Dawn one day, my love, you can live at Starfall. Perhaps my big brother will allow you to serve in his garrison, you can learn to use a sword and a spear if that's what you wish, but only a knight can be the Sword of the Morning and you can't be a knight. Why not? The little girl sounded so offended, and when Ashura let out a little laugh at the tone, it only seemed to make Lauren grow more annoyed with her. I could be a knight. I can learn how to use a sword, and the horse master said that when I am little bit bigger I can learn how to ride a pony. I could be a better knight than anyone. I'm sure that you could, my love, but only men can be knights. I know it isn't fair, but that is the way it has always been and likely the way it will always be. How many men would accept a female knight? How many little boys would dream of following a female knight? How many boys would consent to squire for a woman? How many wouldn't try to take advantage? Ashura knew how cruel the world could be. Lauren looked upset still but didn't ask any more questions as she played with her doll. She looked a bit tired than she did before she had done, and Ashura wasn't at all surprised. The story had always knocked her down when she was a babe in her cradle before she was old enough to ask any questions about it. Of course, it had been the same with her according to her brothers. Every Dane, either from Starfall or High Hermitage, had been told that story when they were still at Brest. How much truth there was in it was a different matter entirely. Without a doubt the first Danes settled on the island in the mouth of the Torrentine, and there they began to build the great castle that Starfall would become, and there was certainly a falling star. But she somehow doubted that Dawn had been pulled out of the breast of a maiden made out of starlight. Everyone knew that Dawn had been made from the stars, but only from a metal that had been pulled from the falling star. The idea of a maid who swore a humble knight to service simply came about a great deal later on after the tale had been told so many times over. And yet, she couldn't deny that she had always loved the story. She still loved it in truth, even now. When she had been a little girl and Arthur had been younger, they had always played the Sword of the Morning and the Star Maiden. When Arnold had been younger and not yet begun his training to become the Lord of Starfall, he would play as well as the Crimson Knight. That was a different version of the story and not one that Ashura would ever tell her daughter. It was a grimmer version of it and often was the one that most little boys wanted to hear it, as it was full of blood and long battles and maids in need of a rescue. In that version, the Crimson Knight was born from a second star that fell not long after the first star did so. He stood at 8 feet tall and his armor was cherry red from the heat, smoke as black as pitch rising up from it as he stood there with a sword that was as black as the night sky. He never lifted his helm, and from inside of it a red light like the fires of the worst of the 7 hells emanated. His greaves were barbed and his gauntlets shaped like claws. In that version, the Crimson Knight absconded with the Lady of the Light and took her over the mountains to a large and dark fortress which had dominated the mountains of Northern Dawn for as long as the mountains had stood. It had long been abandoned and no one had ever known as to what house it had belonged to, if it ever had. But if you asked anyone who had explored it, they would all tell you the same thing. There was the feeling that you did not belong there, and in the dark of the night you could hear ghastly moans from deep within the cellars, moans that would compel anyone to venture down into the dark depths and the misery that they suffered from. But if you did go down into them, you would find nothing but darkness, rats and a chill waiting for you. The knight who had followed the falling star that far would not abandon the Lady of Starlight and thus followed them over the high passes until he himself arrived at the foot of the fort. From outside he could hear the cries and screams and laments of the poor lady as she was made to suffer 1,000 humiliations and indignities. A resurgence of resolve filled him then, and the knight swore to the gods that he would not leave without the Lady of Light. He marched around the castle and yet there was no weak point for him to exploit, no crack which he could slip into. It would take a mighty host to lay siege onto the castle, something that the knight did not have. There were some holdfasts and castles close to the dark fort of course, but the knight was humble and did not know any of the lords by name, and none would raise a host for a knight who had come to them, swearing that a knight and a maid had fallen from the sky in the heart of stars. Then he would be turned away and be accused of having addled wits, and that would be the best outcome. With a cry of frustration, the knight drew back his sword and swung it into the pitch-black stone of the wall. To the knight's amazement, the blade didn't shatter into 1,000 pieces and instead, a crack formed in the wall. It was small and he almost couldn't see it, but it was there. He swung his sword again and again like it was a warhammer, and the crack grew and grew. For how long he stood there, swinging his sword, no man could say, but soon enough the wall gave way to him, a large enough fissure that he could slip through having formed in front of him. He had entered the crack, half crawling and half walking, the damp air inside taking away the warm heat from the outside. The knight soon found himself in the dark cellars of the fort, 1,000 ghastly moans waiting for him deeper in the darkness. And yet, a fair maid like no other awaited him, and thus he steeled himself against whatever dangers he might face and pressed on. As he moved through the darkness he could feel someone moving with him, as if someone was following him, or moving towards him. In the total darkness, it was hard to tell. But there was something there with him, whichever direction the tunnel took, no matter how fast he walked. He could feel it with him. Soon enough, as he kept walking, he came to the stone steps and slowly began to climb them to the main hall of the keep. It was as large as it was bare, with the only decoration seeming to be the silk of the spider webs high up in the corners. There was a raised dais but with no great seat or table set up. It was bare, but as he had approached, he could sense something. Like something should have been there. As he stepped away from the dais, he could hear noise. It almost sounded like music and cheering. He walked down the length of the hall to the great doors at the end and pushed them open, both of them screaming in protest. Across from the keep, there was another hall. A large column of smoke was drifting into the air, but there was no hint of roasting meat in the air. The knight pushed the doors open and walked in. On either side of the hall were long trestle tables with hundreds of men sitting on either side. They were caught in some sort of half-a-life, neither dead nor living. A ragged red slash on all of their throats, almost as mocking as the smiles on their faces, and their eyes were black and empty as a grave pit. The Crimson Knight was sitting at the table, a large pewter goblet clutched in a mailed hand, overflowing with a wine as red as blood, though he made no move to drink from it. How he could was a mystery as he kept his helm on his head. In the light of the torches, his cherry-red glow was as black as night, and the Lady of Light, who was sitting next to him with a golden collar wrapped around her delicate throat, golden chains linking it to the golden fetters around her wrists and around her ankles, even with the tears on her cheeks from the great sorrow of captivity, she was still the most beautiful thing that any man would be lucky enough to see. The sight of the cruelty that had been inflicted on the great beauty from the stars filled the knight with a deep rage, and he drew his sword and challenged the Crimson Knight to a duel. The victor would be allowed to take the Lady of the Light for his bride. The Crimson Knight laughed. Its laughter was deep and echoed in the helm till it sounded like a demon that had crawled out of the hell, his hall of dead men laughing with him. Still, the Crimson Knight stood from his seat, and with one long, great stride he stood over the table and drew his great sword from the sheath that was slung over his back. The black blade was almost as tall as he is and looked sharp enough to cut through metal plate as though it was nothing. He strode down the length of the hall towards the mortal knight, and he raised his blade as the other knight raised his to shield to try and block the blow. The Crimson Knight let out another laugh and drew back his blade with one hand, like a smaller man would wield a dagger, and swung it down. The blade cut through the shield and came to a stop, wedged into the cut that it had made. The force of the blow had sent shockwaves through his arm, breaking it and causing the knight to lose his footing and falling to the floor. The knight tried to stand, but the pain in his arm was overwhelming and he could feel the bile tickling at the back of his throat. The Crimson Knight placed his armored boot on the chest and pressed down slightly. The knight felt the bones in his chest cracking, and he was able to hold on to enough of his pride to not scream as the monster above him pressed down on his chest. The knight tried to use his free hand to reach his sword, but no matter how hard he tried to get it, tried to stretch his fingers further, the sword came no closer, even though it was just a few inches away from his grasp. The hilt of it almost seemed to be mocking him, and if it wasn't, the laughter he heard all around him was most certainly doing it. The monster in the form of a man raised his great sword, and with a savage cry he thrust it down and split his breastplate in half, the steel burrowing into his chest. The knight stared at the black steel blade sticking out of his chest, coughed up a mouthful of blood and died. The great hall filled with cheers as the Crimson Knight pulled his sword free and held it high. But as he turned to go back to his seat, the Lady of Light ran to her fallen knight and held him in her arms. She kissed his brow and wept tears for him as she had never wept for any man, and kissed him deep on the lips. The Crimson Knight dragged her away from the body, but before they could reach their places back at the table, a gasp went all throughout the hall. The wandering knight had stood up, and while no blood was escaping from the wound on his chest, still it remained there. The Crimson Knight marched over to him and raised his blade, but this time the knight was ready for him. His strength was like no mortal man, and thus he dodged and ducked and kept his distance, and throughout it all, neither knight seemed to tire. With a cry of frustration, the Crimson Knight raised his great sword and swung it down with all of his strength, meaning to split the mortal knight's head in half with a single blow. The wandering knight had dodged, and had taken his opening, driving his sword through a gap in his armor where the shoulder guard met the breastplate. The knight gave the Titan not a moment to recover as he drew his blade back once again and shoved it through the ice light of his helm. The knight let out a great bellow, equal parts rage and pain and fear, and turned to dust. And then his hall turned to dust, his host of the damned, his walls and his stables and his wells and cellars and dungeons, and where once a great fortress had stood, now only a mound of fine black dust stood, the knight one side and the Lady of Light on the other. The lady's chains had turned to dust as well, though the gold that had bound her had turned to the same black dust that walls had done. All that remained, was the Crimson Knight's great sword. The Lady of Light picked it up with a strength that no mortal woman had ever possessed. She claimed that the blood that had stained it was that of one of the greatest heroes that she had ever known. She placed a kiss to the dark steel and it turned into the brightest silver that any man had ever seen. From then on the story turned out much the same. She named the night the Sword of the Morning. She left when dawn came and the knight returned to the island to build Starfall. But this version had always been a favorite of the squires and pages and stable boys. There were battles and quests and sorcery and all the things that little boys loved. Though, she would wait till Lauren was a little older till she told her that her daughter had fallen to asleep while she had been lost in her thoughts, and thus she knelt down, carried her over to the cradle, though no doubt the time would come when she would soon need a little bed of her own, sat her down in it and placed her cloth doll at the side of her. The sound of the door opening made her turn around, and while it was not ladylike, Ashura made no effort to hide the groan when she saw Brandon walking into the room. She had asked him, with as much gentleness as she could, to keep away from her and away from Lauren. Of course, it was difficult when she was in his home and Lauren was his daughter as well. It was her own fault, of course. Elia had given her the chance to get away, to go back to Dawn and leave this foolishness behind. They could be back in Starfall by now. She could take Lauren to the top of the Palestone Sword and watched as the morning sun turned the blue sky the most loveliest pink that the world had ever seen. And the way Elia had looked at her when she had turned her down, when she had told her that she would stay. She had been so certain that it had been the right decision, or so it had seemed at the time. All she had seen was that her friend, her sister, wanted rid of her to make her own life easier. Or at the very least, at the time, that was how it seemed. She had been foolish, she hadn't seen the rope that Elia had thrown to her. It was Caitlin that made her realize how stupid she was being, how selfish. Watching her belly swell, watching her as she hummed and went about her business, claiming that the mother's gift did not call for idleness. It was seeing how very, very happy she seemed to be while at the same time knowing nothing of what was happening behind her back. That was what had made her mind up for her. I asked you to leave me be. She pointed out weakly before she walked over to the window of the nursery, also standing in front of Lauren's cradle. Whatever else happened, she was not going to let him have her. It's a pity this isn't your home, nor can you tell me what to do, and you shall not keep my own child from me. There was a dark growl in his voice, and for the first time, she remembered that the wolf blood ran wild and hot in Brandon's veins, and a wolf was not as like to let any man, and certainly not any woman, tell him what to do. You're being childish. The sheer gall made her laugh, though it was a dark and bitter thing. She shook her head. I am being childish. I am trying to be an adult. This cannot be, this will not be. You have a lady wife, and the both of us have shamed her enough. I pray to the seven every night that they will forgive me for being as foolish and weak as I have. Now, you will please leave me, Lord Brandon. She heard Brandon stepping up behind her, and she was ready to spin around and smack him if that was what it took to make him go away, but before she could move, Brandon wrapped her arms around her waist and rested his hands on her stomach before he began to kiss and nip at her neck, blowing on it as well, the heat of his breath making her shiver. Do you honestly think that I haven't noticed? My lady wife's belly hasn't been the only one that's been swelling. How long? Ashura closed her eyes and felt tears running down her cheeks, the shame and the love and the hate and the fear and the desire wrestling inside her for control, threatening to destroy her. She exhaled. I've known for half a moon. Well, there we are then. He kissed her neck again and they stood there in silence. I am leaving Winterfell tonight. I am leaving, and I am taking you and Lauren with me, even if I have to tie you up, gag you and carry you over my shoulder down to the stables and throw you across my house like you're a tied up sow. Caitlyn's your wife, she's going to have your child. A wife chosen for me, a child I don't want. You are someone I would have married 1,000 times over, carrying a child I want and has already given me one. He sounded convincing. Did he not understand what he was truly speaking of? She wanted to turn to look at him, to look into his eyes, but he held her firm. We can go, across the narrow sea, to someone nowhere will find us. I was never meant to be a lord. Father was fooling himself by trying to make me one. I'll take up work as a sellsword. I've only ever been good at fighting and fucking. I'll make us enough coin to buy a manse and we will live there for the rest of our days. She wanted to tell him no, she wanted to scream and curse at him. She wanted to slap him and tell him a selfish fool he was, that had no care for anyone but himself and what he wanted. She wanted to break free of his hold, take Lauren and flee to Lord Rickard and ask him to arrange a galley from White Harbor to take her to Dawn and have her child in Starfall, surrounded by those that she loved more than anyone in the world. But Ashura Dane didn't do any of that. She simply closed her eyes, nodded and fell. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53. The flesh of the blood orange was as sweet and tart as she remembered, and the juices stained her fingers. She had carved the flesh out and cut it into pieces before popping one into her mouth. She picked up another piece of the sweet fruit and offered it to Mors, laughing as the baby bit into the soft flesh and cooed and giggled at the sweetness of the fruit. He was growing so fast. He had been the smaller of her babes, and yet he had become the bigger in the days that he had spent in Dawn. His brother had been born bigger than him, but he had been growing slower than him. Still, he may be growing slower, but Torrhen was still growing, and he would be as healthy and hearty as any babe should. She had spoken to Maester Caliot, The soft and fleshy Maester had not changed at all since she had last seen him, and he was always a welcome sight. She had always preferred him to the one from her childhood. In his opinion, both of the babes had long since left the most dangerous period of their lives, and in his mind there was no reason that they should not continue to thrive. She knew that should have soothed her thoughts, but she couldn't shake the fear that something would happen to them. She still remembered the first time when Doran had told her about what had happened to Mors and Oliver, how one moment they had each been a perfectly happy and healthy babe that always seemed to everyone that they had looked so healthy, that they would thrive and grow strong and would soon enough be playing in the pools with all the other boys and girls at the water gardens. Elia had never known them, but Doran had been 6 when Mors had been born and close to 10 when Oliver had come. He had told her how both of them had left this world. With Mors it had always been a bit more gradual. One day he had seemed a bit sluggish and not as bright as he always seemed to, and from then on it had just gotten worse for him. The poor boy had eventually grown so weak that he couldn't even cry. The Maester had told their mother that it was a poison of the blood and there was little and less that could be done for him, and one day, he had just not woken up from his crib. It hadn't been a surprise. Everyone in Sunspear had known where it was going and that the second son of House Martell was going to die. The tears they wept in the days that followed were not unexpected, but they were bitter and full of grief, and the knowledge that they would come did not make the weeping any easier. With Oliver, it had been so sudden. He had been a happy baby and there had been no illness. One day he had gone to sleep in his crib, and when the Septa had gone to wake him, she had found him dead. The Maester had opened his throat, looking perhaps for a scrap of silk that might have gotten lodged in his throat and stopped him from taking in air in the night. But there had been nothing. He had just died in the night and there was no clue how. The thing that had saddened her the most of it, was nothing to do with her brothers, though there was always a sense of melancholy about the fact that she would never get to know them. No, it was what Doran had said it had done to their mother and their father. It had reduced their mother to a sobbing and screaming wreck both times. It had been so scary for him, as he had only even seen his mother as the Princess of Dawn. He had never seen her lose such control, and it had been terrifying. When Doran had first told her that, she hadn't been ready to believe it. Mother had only ever been the princess, distant, and while she knew that she was loved by her mother, there was always a distance between them while she had still been alive. She had almost been like the spear tower of Sunspear, beautiful and graceful and made of stone. But when she had gotten older and she had thought about it more, she imagined that it really only made sense. Mother had miscarried several times and lost 2 children before Elia was born, and she had been a small and sickly babe, unlikely to survive even a moon's turn. The Septon had told her that in the first few weeks of her life, every day that she had lived was a blessing from the gods. Any other babe would have died. Mother had been terrified that she would die, had woken up each day terrified that would be the day that the wet nurse would come to her and tell her that she had died in the night. She had shielded herself against the hurt of that by not allowing herself to get too close to her. And even when Elia grew and survived, she still did not let down her walls as her illness continued to persist. Strangely, at the same time it also made her mother pay that much more attention to her. While other boys and girls would run through the shadow city of Sunspear, or going riding on their horses through the sand dunes of the desert, or playing in the pools of the water gardens, Elia had been stuck inside under the care of nurses and Septars and the Maester, all of them watching her every single second of every single day. Father had always been protective as well and had always been ready to stand watch over her himself. He had been reduced to a pale spectre when Mors had died according to Doran, and he had been even worse after Oliver had died as well. He oft refused to let her out of his sight, and when he wasn't holding court with his mother, he was almost always with her. Elia had almost resented Oberyn. There was only a year between them after all, and for such a long time when she was a child she didn't understand why they had been treated so different. She was coddled and locked up in order to keep her safe. Oberyn was always allowed to go and play with the others, with bigger boys than him, and to fight, and he almost never got in trouble for it. For a time, when she had been very, very young, she had been convinced that her mother and father must have hated her to keep her locked away, or at the very least had not wanted a daughter. Looking back now, she knew it was silly and foolish, but it was ever so surprising to look back and see what actually made sense to a child. And while there were certainly things that she would change about it if she could, in a perfect world she would have 3 older brothers and not just the one, there were also things she would not change about it if someone offered her all the gold in Casterly Rock and in all the Westerlands besides. Oberyn would always bring her flowers and fruits from the water gardens and would carve her little wooden toys as well. The first had been a dragon with 3 heads. She still remembered the way that he had smiled at her as he held it out for her to take, the toy resting in palms that were covered with cuts that her brother did not seem to mind at all. He had just kept smiling up at her, the smile on his face threatening to outshine the blazing sun above. Father would spend whole days with her and would read her as many stories as she liked and would spend countless hours teaching her letters and numbers. Mother would pick her up and rest her on her knee as she held court and would introduce her to all of the lords and ladies in Dawn, and when she told her all the names of the houses of Dawn, and their words and their banners, she would smile and pat her head and hand her a piece of blood orange cake. Even Doran, whenever he visited from Saltshore, would bring her presents. Mostly old books that he thought that she would like, and more often than not he was right, but he would also bring her little toys, brightly colored dresses, and even one time a Mirish lens which she loved more than any other gift that she had ever been given. She would spend countless hours at night at the very top of the Spear Tower, using the lens to see the stars in the sky as close as she could. Several times she had even fallen asleep up there and had to be carried to her bed by a servant. She could feel the tears pricking at her eyes, and Elia quickly wiped them away before anyone could see. She didn't know why she was crying. She was not sad, though the thought of her childhood was a bittersweet one. Father was gone and Mother had followed after him not too long after, and now she and Oberyn and Doran were separated by thousands upon thousands of miles. Those days would never come again. Elia quickly bowed her head to press a kiss to the top of the babe in her lap's head, and partly to hide her face until the attack of melancholy passed her. She didn't wish to ruin the jovial mood that had fallen on everyone else. Mors cooed at the affection and clung tightly to her, and when Elia pulled back to look at him, she traced his face with her finger. No one could ever make the claim that she was a woman who believed in old wives' tales, but she had to wonder if part of her fear had been the name she chose to give to one of her boys. She had chosen to name him after Mors Martell, her ancestor. She hadn't paid the brother she had never known much thought beyond that, other than telling Ned that he was not who she had chosen to name their son after. Perhaps she hadn't realized that giving him the same name might make her terrified that the same thing would happen to him and his brother. No matter what the master said or didn't he say, she somehow had the sense that she would be suffering with the fear of something happening to her sons for a long time indeed yet. Her melancholy was soon put out of her mind, however, by a savage war cry which made her look up from Mors' face, the sight greeting her making her smile, and for a moment all her fears fled from her. Ned and Oberyn were standing in one of the pools of the water gardens, the water coming up to their knees. Both were shirtless, and Oberyn was perched atop her father's shoulders while Nymeria was perched atop Ned's. Ned and Oberyn were trying to push the other over while Nymeria and Oberyn were trying to push the other off of their shoulders. Ned was taller and broader in the shoulders than Oberyn, and as he tried to push her brother over, she could see the muscles straining under his skin. But Oberyn was a bigger girl than her older sister, and Nymeria was barely able to remain seated on Ned's shoulders, and the rules stated that the first to fall into the water cost their partner the game. Tyen and Arianne were toddling around the pool, holding hands and whispering secrets to one another like they were sisters, even though they did not look much at all alike. One was as dark as the other was fair, but even so, many who would look at them would think that Arianne was Tyen's sister, more than either Oberyn or Nymeria. Sarilla was sitting under the shade of one of the blood orange trees. Little Quentin was sitting next to her with a scepter watching over them. Elia had grown fond her newest little niece, and she was shyer and sweeter than any of her sisters, though she did not doubt that with Oberyn as her father, that would not last long and she would soon be getting herself into trouble. It seemed to her that all of her little nieces had favored their mothers, all except for Oberyn. She had never met the woman and knew nothing about her other that she was from Old Town, was a whore and was dead, but she had seen Oberyn every day of her life, and looking at Oberyn, even with a glance, would be enough to tell that she was his daughter. Her face was the same shape, her nose came to the same point, her eyes were the same color. Oberyn had not been granted any beauty, but she had been granted the same features as her father and the same strength as well. He had always been able to topple the older boys in the pools, and it seemed that Oberyn would not prove to be any different. Her younger sister proved to be as different as the night was to the day. Nymeria's coloring was that of a Dornishman, of that there could indeed be little doubt. The thick dark hair which she oft chose to wear into a long braid that travelled down to her back, the dark eyes that were often as black as a starless sky, and the dark olive skin that burned even darker under the hot sun. But as where Oberyn's mother had been a low-born whore from Old Town, Nymeria's mother had been a noble lady from the free city of Volantis, and she had all of her mother's beauty. Her cheeks were her high, her nose was small and delicate, and her eyes sparkled in the light like two small black diamonds, and indeed in some lights might have even looked like dark onyx. She would be one of the most beautiful women in all of Dawn once she was grown. Elia had no doubts when it came to that. But for now, she was just a little girl playing with her sister and father and her aunt's husband. She wanted to freeze them all in that moment and let no one else into it so that it could remain unspoiled for the rest of time. Though she doubted that it would remain that way. All that was good, always seemed to pass. The thought had come so suddenly and she didn't know from where. The attacks of melancholy were infrequent, but on a day when she had one they would not clear from her no matter what, even when there was so much around to cheer her, whence she was surrounded by all of those that she loved. Elia turned her attention back to her nieces, hoping to shake the thoughts away. Of all her sisters, it was Tyann who resembled her mother the most. Her hair was as fair as wheat and shone like spun gold in the sun, and her eyes were as blue as the sky above their heads. When Oberyn had told her about the scepter he had bedded, she had smacked on the back of the head and had screamed at him for being so very foolish. But Tyann was a sweet girl who had always loved to sit with her when she was ill and read her stories from whatever book that had fallen into her lap that day, or even just to sit and sing with her to try and cheer her. She had loved her so much for that, and perhaps held a certain fondness for Tyann that her other sisters had not quite been able to match. Elia had the sense that she would not meet Sarala's mother, but even with just a glance at her she could tell that she favored her mother over her father. She was as black as a pot of Maester ink and the top of her head was a mop of chestnut curls. Her eyes were a warm and bright amber, and when she laughed, her voice was like a song. And it wasn't just Oberyn's daughters who favored their mother, Arianne favored her mother as well. Melorio was a small woman with eyes the color of golden honey, and Arianne was a small girl with eyes of the same color. Quentyn resembled his father more, with dark curls and dark eyes and a strong-looking nose. Speaking of Doran, he was the only one who was not with them at that moment. He was up in his personal solar, and every now and then she had caught sight of him watching them, but now it seemed as though he had retreated to his solar with Aeryo. Melorio was sitting next to her at the table under the shade of a small clustering of blood orange trees. Torren was sitting in her lap and his chubby little fist was playing with her sapphire, ruby and garnet necklace. Melorio did not seem annoyed and indeed smiled down at her nephew, offering him her finger to which he could clutch on too. Mel seemed to notice that she was staring at them and turned her head to look at him, offering her a warm smile. "Is everything well, Elia? Are you feeling ill? Would you like me to ask Ned to come and take you to bed?" Elia shook her head at her words, but not for the first time she wondered how Doran could be so stupid, to not see what he was losing right in front of him. Mel was kind and generous and had never been anything but dutiful to him and had crossed the narrow sea to be with him, and yet he barely seemed to care sometimes that his union to her was falling apart. She knew that they barely saw one another. Most times when one was holding court in Sunspear, the other would be in the Water Gardens. They did their best to hide it from the rest of Dawn, but it wasn't a well-kept secret that their marriage was an unhappy one. They were able to keep it from the children, and she was thankful enough for that. She knew that Doran had his duties as a prince and that sometimes Melorio wasn't used to that, or the way that they did things in Westeros. She still remembered the argument they had over dinner when the matter came up that any children they might have would more than likely have to be fostered to other lords and ladies to build alliances. It was not a common or even a well-known practice, and Melorio had been completely against it. It had only gotten worse when Arianne and Quint had been born. Elia had to wonder how she would feel when the time came for Mors and Torren to be fostered out. It would be a while yet. Most children didn't get fostered until they were at least 7, and she would enjoy them for every moment that she had them, and there would of course be letters and visits, but even so she couldn't imagine that she would handle the separation from her sons well. It would be even worse if she had both taken away from her at the same time. "I am fine, Melorio, just lost in my thoughts, such as they are." Her hand came to rub her thumb over Mel's knuckles and smiled at her before she turned to look back at the wrestling match taking place in the pool. It seemed that Nymeria had regained her mount and her strength and had almost pushed Oberyn off, but suddenly Ned's feet slipped and fell backward, grabbing onto Oberyn's arm as he fell and dragging both him and Oberyn under the surface as he and Nym fell, sending a wave of water over the edge of the pool, soaking Arianne and Tyann's feet and sending them both into a fit of giggles. After a moment, Ned, Oberyn and Nymeria all surfaced, laughing. Even Oberyn was smiling before she splashed at her sister, and soon another great battle was on. If only all battles brought such joy and brought no injuries onto those who fought them. If all disputes could be solved this way, then perhaps the world would be a better place than it was. But she was no such fool as to believe that would ever be the case. Elia and Melorio watched them playing in the pool for a time. the moments slipping past like golden sand through their fingers. Tien and Ariane had joined them and Quentin and Sarala were dipping their feet into the water under the careful eye of the Septa. A small cough brought her attention and made Elia look away from the pool to see a servant approaching, a letter clutched in her hands. "This came but a few minutes ago, Princess. Maester Kaliat wished for me to bring it to you." Elia took the sealed letter with a word of thanks and looked down at the paper, sealed with a blob of grey wax. The fierce head of the stark direwolf emblazoned upon it. As her fingers came up to trace the seal, a chill of cold ran through her despite the blazing sun above them. Dark wings, dark words. As she stared down at the letter, Elia knew that whatever was hidden by the wax seal would not bring them any joy, but she also knew that it couldn't be avoided. Her fingers brushed over the hardened wax for a moment before she called out to Ned. "Ned, there's a letter and it looks to be from Winterfell." Ned looked at her and then smiled before he crawled out of the pool and stood up, droplets of water running down his chest and his wet trousers clinging to his legs like a second layer of skin. His skin had been baked brown by the sun. In the first few weeks that they had been in Dawn, the sun had been burning his skin red and it had caused him a great deal of pain and he was forced to stay inside, but as of late, he had been able to bear it better than he had been. She held the letter out for him and he took it from her hand, glancing down at it for a moment before he looked back up at her. "I imagine that it's my father summoning up back to Winterfell. We've been here far longer than I had been expecting." They had indeed. They had only come to Dawn to show her brothers their sons. They hadn't expected to be in Dawn for longer than a week, but as soon as they arrived, their departure for their return journey back to Winterfell had been put off more and more. Ned had been interested in speaking to Doran about the Sand Steeds and proposed the idea of some matches between Dawn and House Ryswell of the North, try and breed houses that were as fast and enduring as the Sand Steeds but large enough that they could support a knight in full armor. Doran had seemed so interested in the idea, as did Oberyn, who always had an interest in horseflesh and was often in the stables of Sunspear, overseeing the breeding and care for the steeds. Elia had missed them so much, that the thought of going back to Winterfell hadn't occurred to her in all the weeks they had stayed. The Sand Snakes had also grown fond of their Uncle Ned and none of them wanted them to leave yet, even though Oberyn would neither call Ned that or would admit it. Letters had been sent back to Winterfell, assuring them that all was well and they would be returning shortly. Shortly never seemed to come, however. If it was just a summons to return to Winterfell, then she would be fine with that, happy. But a summons wouldn't be instilling this sort of dread into her as she watched Ned's strong fingers break away the wax and unfolding the paper, his eyes scanning the words. After a few moments of reading, his fingers clenched tightly around the paper and he let out something that sounded like a strangled gasp. "Ned, what is it?" Elia asked as she handed Mors over to Melorio, who sat him on her knee next to his brother before standing and walking over to her husband. When she glanced behind him, she saw that Oberyn had gotten out of the pool and was standing up with his arms crossed over his chest, a frown on his face. Ned handed the letter over to her with a look on his face that she couldn't describe. At first she thought that it was a look of horror, but it looked too angry for that. She began to read the letter for a moment and felt horror, shock, disappointment and rage and sadness running through her as she read the words on the paper in her hands. "Ned. As soon as you get this letter you need to come back to Winterfell, as soon as you can. Something's happened and I have no idea what to do. Brandon's gone. He left Winterfell a few nights ago and no one has any idea where to look for them or where they went, and Ashura and her daughter are gone as well, and he left a note saying not to look for them. Father's going mad. I don't think I have ever seen him this angry before in my life." As soon as he read Brandon's note, he tipped the table over and threw his chair through a window. "The Maester says that if he doesn't calm down then he's going to have another attack and Benjen won't stop crying because of how scared he is. Caitlin was hiding up in her room for days, not eating, but now she's sent a letter to her father and he's coming to Winterfell, but we don't know if that's just to talk or if it's to bring an army. Father's not taking any chances though, because he's sent a few hundred archers down to Moat Cailin to hold the causeway if they have to. Ned, please, you need to come back now. I am scared and I have no idea what to do, and I am trying to be brave for Ben but I can't. Please come, Ned. Please come right now. Lyanna." She had to read the paper again, and again before the words finally sunk in, and when they finally did, she shut her eyes and let her fingers release the hold on the paper. It fluttered towards the ground as she shut her eyes and imagined all the things that she could have done to stop this. Ashura was her lady, she could have commanded her to come to Dawn with them and all this could have been avoided. Gods, To think of how happy she was when she learned that Ashura was coming north with her, that she was bring Lauren with them as well. That she wouldn't be alone in a strange land with strange people. How grateful she had been when Doran had summoned her down from Starfall to accompany her north. Something clicked in her mind then and there. Why had Doran chosen to summon Ashura to act as her lady? There were hundreds in Dawn who would be so grateful for the honor, but Doran had chosen Ashura. And he had chosen her after the betrothal had been set, and Ashura had brought Lauren with her north, and Doran had not commanded her not to. In that one moment, Elia saw all the pieces of the puzzle that had been bothering her for so long falling into place, and it all made a horrible, brutal sense, and a mix of rage and horror filled every single inch of herself. She turned to Melorio. "Mel, take the children to my chambers please. Ned, come with me." She didn't wait for her husband's answer or for anyone to ask any questions, she simply stormed inside the water gardens. Someone was following her, but she didn't look back to see who it was. Her mind was focused on one thing and one thing alone. She climbed up to the second level of the leisure place that a Prince of Dawn had made for his Targaryen bride and walked the lengths of the pink marble corridors until she came to the oak door that would lead into Doran's solar. She did not knock on the door, she threw it open and walked inside. It was so sudden that Arrow Hotter drew his long axe up and looked ready to charge at her like he was a bull, but once that he saw that it was her, he hesitated and Doran held up his hand to gesture for him to stand down. "Is there a reason you have decided to burst in my solar without knocking? Have you forgotten your manners and courtesies?" She wanted to slap him right there and right then. He knew. He had to know what had happened. He had planned for this. She managed to hold herself back and kept herself calm as Ned came to stand next to her, his face a mask of confusion. "Brandon Stark has run off with Ashura. He has taken Lauren with them as well. Ashura wouldn't leave her either way, but Brandon would have as well, because she is his daughter as well. But you knew that, that's why you sent her with me to the north. You planned for all of this." Ned looked at her like she had just said that the wall was made of frogs, but Doran just stared at her for half a heartbeat before he stood up from his chair and poured himself a goblet of strong wine before picking it up and taking a sip from it. "Arrow, would you be so kind as to close the door for us?" The captain of the guards nodded and went to shut the door without saying a word. "You don't deny it, Prince Doran, you knew that Ashura had a child with my brother." Ned's voice sounded so cold that it would be able to freeze the Sea of Dawn on the hottest day of the year. Elia didn't think that she had ever heard him so angry in all the time that she had known him. "If that's so, then why did you send her north with Elia? Let us be clear, I did not know that Ashura had a bastard with your brother, though I certainly suspected." Doran's face quivered from the pain in his legs, but for the first time in possible all of time, Elia found that she didn't care about his pain. She might have even thought that he deserved it. "We all knew that Lauren's father was not a Dornishman, and your brother's appetites were known well enough, Lord Eddard. Even if it turned out that Brandon wasn't her father, Ashura would serve well enough. Your brother is known for being charismatic, and Ashura is a beautiful woman, some would even call her the most beautiful woman in the world. One way or another, I knew that Brandon would fall for temptation and take her and would soil his reputation and would more than likely be disinherited. The fact that Lauren was his daughter, well, that just made it all the easier." "Why?" There was a dangerous edge to Ned's voice that made Arrow run his hand over his long axe and take a step forward, but Doran held up his hand again to stop him. "Explain to me why you would do this, and do it now." Doran let out a sigh before he sat back down, clearly unable to keep standing due to the pain in his legs building up. "You are a good man, Lord Eddard. A very good man indeed. You are honorable, kind, and indeed wiser than I had been expecting, and your idea for a match between Dawn and House Ryswell is an excellent one, and you treat my sister better than I could hope, but you are a second son. Do you really think I would allow my sister, a princess of Dawn, to be wed to a man who was heir to nothing? I wouldn't. I need to get Brandon out of the way so that you would be the heir to Winterfell instead of him, and it has worked almost perfectly, I think." There was no gloating in Doran's voice. That was the worst thing of all. He wasn't a villain from a song who was boasting all over his plans coming to fruition. He was her brother, and he almost sounded sad. "And in truth, it's all for the best. Lauren gets 2 parents, Brandon is free of his responsibilities, which I am led to believe that he doesn't enjoy. The North gets a finer Lord Paramount in you than it would in your brother. Elia gets to become the Lady of Winterfell, and my nephew is now the heir to Winterfell when you become Lord Eddard." Doran took another sip of his wine then before he spoke again. Everyone's happy. Everyone is not happy. Caitlin Tully and the child she carries is not happy at all. Lord Ricard and Lord Hoster are not happy. Elia growled out as she took another step towards him. Your foolish plan failed, Doran. Hoster Tully is going to Winterfell right now and Caitlin Tully's child will be the heir to Winterfell once it's born. If. Doran replied, a cool look on his face, and Elia saw that her brother was gone and the Prince of Dawn had taken his place. If the child is born, it might not, and many and more things have not been settled yet. And Lord Ricard, well, things are never quite as they seem, are they? He knew exactly who Lauren was the moment he set eyes on her. He told me so in a letter, and he knew what his son was as well. Did you not find it odd that Brandon and Ashura were able to escape from Winterfell so easily? I think I will leave it up to him to explain the most of it. Needless to say that the alliances will hold as they have done. I imagine you will both be returning north. Yes, yes we are. Today in point of fact. Ned spoke quickly and emotionlessly, his eyes as dark as pair of fat grey storm clouds. Prince Doran, I thank you for your hospitality, but I find that we have no more need for it. I will ride for Planky Town once I have changed and find a ship that will take us back north. Excuse me. With that, Ned turned and left the room and slammed the door hard behind him. Well, that's the end of that. I trust you will that he is soothed. Elia whirled on Doran then and slapped him hard across the face and then backhanded him with the same hand on his other cheek. She would have slapped him again, but before she could, Hotter came forward and clamped his meaty hand around her wrist like it was an iron manacle. Princess, you forget yourself. His voice came out in a quiet rumble, like a thunderstorm approaching, while Doran took out a handkerchief and dabbed at the thin trail of blood where the fire onyx of her ring had dug into his skin. With a single word he ordered Hotter to let her go as he looked up at her from where he sat. I will forgive that. I will not. Elia spat as she rubbed at her sore wrist from the strength behind Arrow's hold. It was almost throbbing in pain. I will not forgive this, any of it. I do not care for what reason you did any of it, it is unforgivable. You used me, my friend, her daughter, my husband and his family like we were all pieces on game board to you. You and Lord Ricard both. I may step foot in Dawn again, Doran, but I promise you. So long as you draw breath, I shall not forgive you. She turned and began to make her way to the door, but Hotter stepped in front of her, an impassable mountain of a man. Let her go, Captain. For a moment, Doran sounded so sad and tired that she wanted to tell him that she hadn't meant it, but she didn't do that. Once Hotter had stepped out of her way, she made her way to the door and slammed it shut after she had left before making her way through pink marble corridors towards the apartments that Doran had gave them when they had arrived. Ned was dressed in northern riding leathers, and not the sort that Doran had given him not to cook in as he rode, when she arrived, and looked more angry than she had ever seen him. Melorio was sitting in the corner and left the room with a look of deep sorrow and confusion before she left the room, and soon it was just the two of them, the babes asleep in the other room. You can't think that I knew anything about this. She muttered quietly as Ned packed his clothes away in a trunk, the few he had decided to keep. He froze for a moment at her words before letting out a deep sigh and turning to face her, walking over to pull her close to him. Elia almost cried when she felt him kiss the top of her head. I know that you didn't. His words did bring on the tears, and he held her for a moment before he pulled back. But I cannot, I will not stay here for a second longer. I can't. Elia nodded, she couldn't either, and so she decided to help him pack. As they packed, Oberyn came to them and asked what had happened, and when Elia told him, he had a look of murder in his eyes that had this not happened, she might be more concerned about what he meant to do. Once all the trunks were packed, Ned left to ride to Planky Town. He came back a few hours later as the sky was starting to turn a dark shade of pink. There was a trading ship from the Summer Isles going up to White Harbor, carrying silk and cinnamon and cloves, but it would not be leaving till the morning. Neither of them wanted to stay a moment longer than they actually had to, and so they still set off that night. They arrived in Planky Town with the moon high in the sky and the chill setting into her bones, and with two very unhappy babes. Yella gave them beds for the nights and hot wine to warm them. When the morning finally came after the longest day of her life, they were finally sailing home. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54. When her father had read the words that had come to Riverrun by the black wings of a raven, Lysa didn't think that she had ever seen him so angry as she had done in that moment. His face had turned as pale as one of her bedsheets, and the blue of his eyes had widened while the black dots in the center had shrunken, and his hands had clutched at the paper so tightly that he was fairly sure that he was going to rip it in half. Lysa had not been able to see what had been written on the paper herself, as her father had stormed out of the room after he had finished reading the letter, slamming the door after he had left so hard that it almost splintered the wood. Uncle Brindon had told her not to be concerned about it with the warm smile that had always comforted her when she was a little girl and had scrapped her knee, or when Kat had chosen to play with someone else over her. But she had seen something in his eyes that had made her incapable of not worrying. He was scared as well. She had always known her uncle wasn't telling her something, and she wanted to know. She needed to know, but according to Master Vimon, her father, her uncle, the steward and the Master-at-Arms had still not left her father's solar. It was unbearable waiting for any news. It wouldn't be as bad if she could speak to Kat about it, but she had heard no word from her. She had wondered if the letter was from Kat, but she couldn't imagine what Kat could have written that would have made their father so angry. Kat had only ever made their father smile. Lysa wasn't a fool. She had always known that her father had a favorite child, and it was not her, and it was not Ed Muir. The worst thing was, Lysa couldn't hate Kat for that. She had loved Kat more than anyone. She had been there her entire life. Even with how hard it was for her for Kat to be the more beautiful one, the smarter one, the one with more poise, who all of the boys gave their flowers to, and all of the knights wanted her favor over Lysa's. Some younger sons and nephews might pay her a compliment, but it was always Kat who shined that much brighter than her, every single time. It would have been so much easier to bear if Kat had always been mean to her, had been the older sister who would laugh at her, would push her down into the mud and pulled at her hair, but Kat had always been a perfect older sister who had played with her when she was lonely, even though she was older than her by almost 4 whole years, and would read to her when she was sick. They had even invented a secret language when they were girls, as a way to speak about the people around them without anyone knowing who they were speaking of, a perfect way to share secrets. If Lysa tried, then she was fairly sure that she could write a letter to Kat in that same tongue. She wished that she could send a raven to Kat now, as it would mean that she would be able to know what she did and no one else would have to. But they weren't little girls playing their secret games anymore. They were both of them women grown, and Kat was beyond her now. It was part of the reason that Lysa was certain that the letter had been from her. Father had forbidden her from sending any letters, and now only he, the maester, the steward and the Master-at-Arms were allowed to go into the rookery. Her entire world at times had seemed to shrink to her chambers as of late. She couldn't speak to her father or her uncle, as they always seemed to be rushing after something more important than her. Poor Petter was still in a foul mood about Caitlin being gone and refused to talk to her as well. Lysa had a few ladies and maids about her, but she didn't truly consider any of them friends, and Ed Muir was just a stupid little boy. They had never been close to one another, and it had always been Kat who had bridged the divide between them. It would be better once she was married to Sir Jaime and off at Casterly Rock, being prepared to be its future lady. It had all that she had been looking forward to. It had been the fuel for all her dreams. She would be wearing a dress of green and gold brocade with a cloak of her father's colors, and all would smile at her as she walked down the length of the September of Casterly Rock, to her future husband. In her dreams, Jaime Lannister would look even more handsome than he did when she had seen him at Riverrun. His curls would look like spun gold that would shine in the candlelight, and his beautiful green eyes would shine like emeralds, and when he looked at her, he would smile like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Lysa would turn her back to him so that he could remove her bridal cloak, and she would run her fingers over his cloak once he had put it on her shoulders, taking her into his protection. All the ladies and lords and noble knights would clap and cheer for them then, for their future lady. Lord Hoster would be smiling so proudly. In that moment Lysa was sure that none of his children would ever make him so proud as she would when she took the young lion of Casterly Rock as her husband. Not even Kat would make him that proud. She would be there as well, of course. With Brandon Stark standing next to her, his arm around her waist. Kat would kiss her cheeks, and she would smile at her and tell her how beautiful she looked, how she had outshined even her own wedding day. Cersei Lannister would be there with Prince Rhaegar, and she would kiss her on her cheeks as well, telling her how happy she was to have another sister, and Prince Rhaegar would say that he had never seen anyone even half as beautiful as her. Then they would go to the feast. There would be suckling pig and river pike served with mashed yellow beets and green leaves, and pies filled with venison and mushrooms. And smaller pies as well, filled with pork and beef and mutton and pies and eggs and cheese. Ducks and swans would be stuffed with plums and nuts, and there would be cheese and beer as well, served with every single course. And the sweets, that was what she would look forward to the most throughout it all. There would be tarts, blackberry ones and strawberry ones and blueberry ones, and pastries filled with sweet cream and almonds and jams, and cakes made with honey and lemon cakes as with, large ones with spun sugar decorations, of lions and trouts and castles, and some lavender biscuits and apples baked in cinnamon. Jaime would serve her, of course, the Lord's portion, and the choicest of morsels he would feed to her himself. In between each bite of food, he would sneak a kiss, and by the time the sweets had come, his kisses would be even more delicious than them, and Lysa would want nothing more than to spend the rest of her life kissing him, more than even Petter. Petter would be there as well, of course, and he would cast a single perfect tear at the sight of her being wed to someone else, but he would be understanding and happy for her, and Lysa would make sure that he was given something to do. She had never been to the Fingers, but the way that Petter had described had always made it seem such a dismal little place that someone as bright and as brilliant as Petter should not be condemned to spend the rest of his life. He was always so good with numbers, perhaps she could find him some high position in Lannisport. If he served well, then in time he could rise to be as high a lord as Lysa always knew that he was destined to be. And he would kiss her cheek and thank her with all of his heart, because he would realize that it was all due to her. That it was always her who was on his side. Soon enough, the bedding would come, and Lysa would blush so prettily and giggle until she couldn't breathe as the men picked her up and carried her off to the bedchamber, where she would get under the covers and would wait for her husband to arrive. His chest would be bare when he came to her, a smirk on his handsome face when he saw her and climbed into the bed with her. When he slipped inside of her, Lysa would cry just a little at how good it felt. She would scratch at his back and cling to him, and would moan once she reached her peak and felt him spill inside of her. The thought of the result of that night made her smile, a little babe with golden curls like his father and her deep blue eyes on their face. She let out a sigh as she felt sun gently bathing on her face, pulling her out of her thoughts. It had been raining for the past several days, an almost constant downpour which seemed to be reflecting her own mood and the mood of Riverrun as well. She hoped that the sight of the sun meant that things were finally about to change and that all would be well. The door to her chamber opened then, and when she turned, her mood soured slightly and a frown came onto her face when she saw that it was her uncle. The sight of him was always a welcome one, but the sight of him in armor was unusual when he was inside the walls of Riverrun. "Lysa, love, your father wants to see you right away. Come with me." Lysa frowned as she gathered up her skirts and stood up from the window seat and followed her uncle out of her chamber. The castle seemed more silent than usual, and it was unnerving. They eventually arrived outside her father's solo, where two guardsmen were standing guard. The one on the left nodded and went inside to announce her before coming back out to show her inside. Hoster Tully was standing out on the balcony. Like his younger brother, he was dressed in armor as well, with a sword belt wrapped around his waist. Was there to be a war? Her mind was thrown back to the conversation she had overheard with her father and her uncle in the old servants' passage. That was how she knew she was going to marry Sir Jaime before he had come to Riverrun after all. But they had spoken about things that hadn't made sense to her as well, something about how many men that the Westerlands and the Reach could field together when compared to the rest of the kingdoms, and not wanting to risk the king's wrath, and something about a boy and what they had planned for him. It was so hard to remember any of it now, to be honest. She had been so giddy when they spoke of her marrying Jaime that all the rest of it had faded away like mist in the daylight. Lysa didn't know anything about wars or battles, but that certainly seemed like the talk that men would have when it came to war. Something about the king as well. Had someone threatened him? Sure, he would have called for all the swords in the 7 kingdoms by now if that was true. "Father, you wanted to see me?" she called out from behind his desk, her hands delicately folded in front of her. If there was to be a war, then father would tell her. Surely he would. Hoster Tully did not turn his gaze away from the horizon, he simply kept staring forward. After a moment of silence, he spoke. "Lysa, darling, come here. I want you to see something." He beckoned her forward with a wave of his hand, and Lysa went forward to stand next to him on the balcony. She looked down as the Tumblestone gently babbled past, its surface being unbroken for the first time in days. Her father turned to her and reached out to move a lock of her back behind her ear. He looked older than he had done the last time she had properly seen him. "Lysa, listen to me. Your uncle and I need to go north for a time, your sister has been insulted and disgraced. He turned away from her then and walked over to the edge of the balcony, clutching his hands into fists. That ungrateful bastard of a husband made mockery of her, he dishonored by having relations with a lady in service to Princess Elia, and the both of them have fled from Winterfell and apparently, no one knows where they've gone. Lord Rickard claims to have been ignorant of all of this, ha! Does he think I am fool? This was all under his nose, in his seat, with his heir, and he knew nothing. He insults me, and Catelyn is alone and has a child growing inside of her. I will not tolerate this. Lysa didn't know where to begin with all that she had just learned. She knew that something bad must have happened and she had suspected that it might have had something to do with Catelyn, but this had been the last thing that she thought had happened. Why would anyone abandon Cat? She was so beautiful and kind, and if she was pregnant, then that was clearly proof enough that she was fertile. Lord Brandon would have no reason at all to be displeased with her, certainly not enough to run away with some Dornish whore. Princess Elia only had one lady in service to her, the Lady Ashura of House Dane of Starfall. She was a beautiful woman, with thick dark hair, light olive skin and violet eyes. Lysa knew she was considered one of the most beautiful women in the world, but what an awful woman she must be, to steal away Cat's husband from her while she was pregnant with his child. Lysa hoped they both paid for it. What is Cat to do? Is she going to come back home? Lysa hoped that would be the case. Poor Cat would be so upset over all that had happened, but she would be better once she came back to Riverrun. The babe would be little better than a bastard, of course, but it would be loved and accepted. She would make sure enough of that, and mayhaps once it was old enough, it could squire for Edmure, and once Lysa was married to Sir Jaime, she would send for Catelyn to come with her, to serve her as one of her ladies. What fun they would have together. But it seemed as though that was not to be, at least not for the moment, as her father shook his head at her question. He looked so furious, as though he had been hiding it up to now, but now that he had told her the truth he saw no reason to, and she could not deny that the fury that she saw in her father's eyes at that moment still terrified her like it did when she was little, the same sort that would send her running and hiding up in a tree in her mother's gardens or in some little nook in the castle, hoping he wouldn't find her and would forget about her, and that would be the end of it. No, Lysa, Cat will be staying where she is if I have anything to say about it. Brandon Stark might have abandoned her, but the child she is carrying is still his, and thus is Lord Rickard's grandson and heir. I will not stand by if Lord Rickard thinks he can somehow set your sister aside or cheat my grandchild of their rights. Then he will have quite a shock coming to him. Your uncle and I are going to ride north with 200 men, not enough to threaten Winterfell to be sure, but more than enough to make sure that the message is clear to Lord Rickard. Her father put his hands on her shoulders and stared into her eyes as he continued to speak. Lysa, listen to me. Your brother is still just a young boy, and while he might be Lord of Riverrun, there is much and more that he still doesn't know about what it means to be a lord. You sat in with me and your sister while I held court, so while your uncle and I are gone, it will fall to you to guide your brother and to rule the Riverlands in my stead. I know that I can count on you, love. The words made her smile and made her face turn redder than her hair. He had never said anything like that to her. To Cat, certainly. It had always been Cat that Lord Hoster had asked questions to when he had held court, to make sure that she was listening. Lysa had always just sat quietly at his side. She hadn't paid much attention after it had become clear to her that holding the court was mainly just for Cat to learn. But really, it didn't matter much at all. She already knew everything she needed to know. The Brakens and the Blackwoods hated one another. Lord Free was very old and always wanting more than he actually deserved. That was really all she needed to know, and she could handle the rest as it came. She was sure that she could. Don't worry, father, I will take care of everything. I know you will, sweeterling. In truth, you won't have to do that much. The steward and the maester will do most of the day-to-day work and ruling, managing the castle and whatnot, but it will be up to you to hold court. Edmure is still a young boy. When I was his age and your grandfather held court, all I wanted to do was run off and go sparring in the yard, but my father made sure that I stayed, and because I stayed, I learned. He will need to learn as well. Make sure that he stays and doesn't run off. I will. Lysa said with a nod. She could do this. She was certain that she could. Lord Hoster pressed another kiss to her forehead and dismissed her and asked her to send his brother in to him. Lysa withdrew and left the room, and then sent her uncle into the room after her and began to make her way through the stone corridors of Riverrun, 1,000 thoughts rushing through her head like a river. She didn't think she had ever lived a day without seeing either her father or her uncle. When Lord Hoster had ridden off to go and deal with some quarrelling bannerman, then it would be Uncle Brindon she would go to for comfort and advice, and when Uncle had ridden off into the night after he had yet another fight with Father, well, she was never one to run to Father for comfort anyway, but she at least had the knowledge that he was there at the very least. But now they would both be gone, off to save her sister from the heart of the savage north. It almost seemed like something out of a song. There had never been enough music at Riverrun for Lysa's taste. When they all came back she would have a feast held for them, and there would be plenty of music. Singers and pipers and harpists as well. She might arrange for some fools as well, jugglers and jousters on top of them. Poor Cat would need as much cheering up as she could get. She was still young, though not as young as her, and beautiful besides, but she was damaged goods now. Her child might be heir to Winterfell and it might stay in the north, but Cat would surely have to come back to Riverrun, and her father would never be able to find her as good a match as he had done with Brandon Stark. What lord would have her now? A sudden and terrible thought struck her, as if someone had just shot a crossbow bolt at her. He wouldn't try and give Catelyn to Jaime, he couldn't do that. It wasn't fair, the match had been made for her and not for Cat. But father had always preferred Cat, always. He would fight for her and her rights in a way that he would never do for her. He would never ride hundreds of miles with hundreds of knights for her. She had always known that. Lysa was always given the second best of everything her in entire life, and Jaime was going to be hers. Cat couldn't take that from her, she couldn't. A wave of sadness struck her then, as overpowering as a wave during an autumn storm. A rough sob escaped from her throat as she imagined Cat taking her place in her dreams, wedding Jaime and being the Lady of Casterly Rock, while Lysa was left with nothing. Married to someone awful, an old man with no teeth like Walder Free or Eldon Estermont or Jon Arryn. It was all too much, it was all so unfair. Another sob escaped her throat and she pushed herself forward, bringing up her hand to cover her mouth. She was vaguely aware that she wasn't even running in the directions of her chamber anymore, she was just running in any direction. Perhaps if she ran fast enough, then she might be able to escape her pain. She turned a corner so quickly that she didn't see anything that was in front of her until it was too late, and so with a cry, she collided with someone and fell to the stone floor. She pushed herself up by her hands and was ready to pick herself up and run off before whoever she bumped into had a chance to yell at her, but she was frozen in her tracks when she saw that it was Petter, her beautiful Petter. Whenever she saw him, she always felt so guilty. He had looked so shocked when her Lord Father had announced publicly to all of Riverrun that he was arranging a match between herself and the young lion of Casterly Rock. She had wanted to go to him right there and then hold him to her, to tell him that he was still dear to her and that she would never forget him and that he could come with her to the Westerlands, but once she had approached him, he had run off. Since then, the air between them had been icy indeed, and Lysa had tried to give him some time, some space. He would come around. Petter must have felt what was between them. The love that they both shared. She didn't understand why he made it all so difficult, why he insisted on fighting it, why he acted like he almost hated her sometimes when she knew that he didn't. He did seem annoyed at her at the moment, but she could understand that. She had just run into him. Petter got to his feet as Lysa rubbed at her eyes to try and hide that she had been crying. It seemed to work, as Petter did not seem to have noticed. He rubbed his fingers, long and delicate and lovely, over the blue silk doublet that she knew was one of the finest things that Petter owned. "What's wrong with you, Lysa? Is there a reason you're charging through the halls like a rampaging rock?" Lysa gathered up her skirts and got to her feet, embarrassment rushing through her entire body. "I am so sorry, Petter, I was just so upset for a moment and I lost control of myself. I didn't hurt you, did I?" she asked as reached out, unable to hold back a shiver as her fingers came into contact with his soft skin and she stared into his grey-green eyes. They were such beautiful eyes. They were not the brilliant emeralds of Jaime Lannister, to be sure, but they were just as beautiful in their own way. They always seemed to hold secrets in them, mysteries. Things that Lysa always wanted to find out, to better understand him, but at times she thought that burrowing through the wall with a spoon might have been an easier task. Petter pulled back and Lysa frowned at the lack of contact, but she soon forgot that when she saw Petter starting at her with those lovely eyes, burrowing into her skin and seeing straight into her. When he looked at her like that, all thoughts of Jaime and Casterly Rock and being the lady of a great house fled from her like the survivors of a defeated army after a devastating battle. And what exactly could have been so distressing to my lady, that has made her so upset? Tell me, Lysa, I might be able to help. He couldn't, of course. Peta had no men to command, and she knew that her father would be angry at her for telling what he meant to do before he was ready, but Peta would never hurt them, and he was too clever to tell anyone, and he would never betray her. Peta would never be so wicked as to get her into trouble, and so, Lysa told him everything. Once she was finished speaking, Peta had turned very quiet, which struck her as worrying, as she had never known Peta to lack for words. Of course it was understandable, he had always been so fond of Cat, and now he heard how she had been shamed, dishonored, ruined. It made her angry as well, and so sad, but what could they truly do about it now? Cat would have to bear the same. She reached out for Peta, to hold him and pull him close to her so that she could give him comfort, to offer shelter from the onslaught of what he must be feeling, but before she could close even half the distance between them, he spun on his feet and stormed off, muttering something under his breath that she couldn't hear. She wanted him to come back, she wanted to command him to come back. He couldn't walk away from her, but the command froze in her throat and wouldn't come out no matter how hard she tried. Misery all she had left. She brushed her tears, which had stirred up once again, and spun back to make her way back the way she had came, heading back in the direction of her chambers. Let Cat come back, it didn't matter. In the end, she would have everything, and Cat would have to live on her generosity one day, her kindness. Oh yes. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55. Winterfell was always beautiful, always a source of comfort for him, and even in the hardest of times, or at least it always had been. In times such as this, however, the comfort that Ned had come to expect from Winterfell was not as ready as it always had been. Part of it was due to waiting for Lord Hoster to come and meet with them in Winterfell, but that was not the only reason that everything seemed more difficult as of late. Returning from Dorne had been arduous, and not for the first time. Ned wondered if it might have been better to return overland instead of by ship, but if they had, then they would have passed too close past King's Landing if they had taken the route through the Prince's Pass, and would have fallen under the King's gaze. They could have gone through the Bone Way, which would take them through the Stormlands, as if Ned was sure of anything it was that he could trust Robert more than anyone else, and that he would welcome them with open arms if they turned up at Storm's End. But either way overland they would eventually have to cross through the Riverlands, and that would mean putting themselves at the mercy of Lord Hoster and hoping that they would be able to pass through unnoticed. If they had gone overland, Ned didn't doubt they would have wound up the guests of either King Aerys with the threat of being burned alive, or guests of Lord Hoster to gain some leverage over his father. No, he knew that going by sea had been the safest option, but it had taken a great deal out of Elia. She had come down with a fever, and for a few days that never seemed to end he had been terrified that he would lose her, that their sons would grow without their mother to watch them grow into little boys and spar with wooden swords before learning how to use true steel, to watch them grow into men who would take wives of their own and have their own children, make them both grandparents. He could think of nothing worse, if she wasn't able to see all of that. He had covered her with every blanket and scrap of fur he had been able to find on the boat, and that by itself had led to some tense moments which had led to him not taking of his sword belt for the rest of the voyage back to the north. He had also practically poured hot spiced wine and onion broth down her throat to try and keep her strength up and to break the fever. Alas, she seemed to simply hover in her fever for almost all of the journey, not getting any worse, which he was beyond thankful for, but she didn't seem to get any better either, and it had terrified him. Care for their sons had thus fallen onto him as well, and that had left him exhausted. He had lost track of how many nights he had shut his eyes for a moment only to be woken up once again by the cry of a babe, or by Elia succumbing to another fit of coughing. By the time their ship had finally arrived in White Harbor, Ned was half feverish himself, and he was ready to collapse himself when they finally presented themselves to Lord Wyman at the Merman's Court. Considering all the services that the man had done for them and his house over the recent moons, Ned didn't doubt that soon enough there would be a Marndale married to a Stark soon enough. Lord Wyman didn't have any daughters, as far as he was aware, and while he did have sons, Lyanna was his father's only daughter, and she was promised to Robert. More than likely, if Ned had to guess, Benjen was going to find himself as a ward of Lord Wyman, and when he did finally have a daughter of his own, Benjen would find himself wed to her. It was odd to think of Benjen as being betrothed to someone. In truth, he was a little older than most boys were when they were fostered. He was older than both Ned and Brandon had been when they had both been fostered off, to the Vale for Ned and to Barrowtown for Brandon. Ned really wasn't sure why his father had waited so long to send Benjen off, but if he had to guess, He had to assume that it was because he had sent both of his older sons away when duty called. He had wanted to keep at least one son close to raise as his own. But duty was always the one thing that Starks couldn't avoid, and soon winter would be over, but it would always come again and again and again, and they would have to be ready for it. Childhood melted away as easily as summer did, and Benjen would have to become a man if he was to face it, even though he had to admit that the thought of him growing up did bring a sadness onto him. When he thought of Benjen, the first thing that came to his mind was the little boy who would always follow him throughout the halls of Winterfell when he had come visiting from the Vale, with scraped knees and a sword made of wood and messy black hair, and make him promise to not tell father about sparing with Lyanna. Whatever Lord Wyman would expect or plan as a reward for his service, at the moment he had arrived with a wife that was half dead, 2 babes who were feverish to the touch and shitting their swaddling, and he barely being able to stand due to taking care of all of them. Lord Wyman had summoned his maester and nursemaids and septars, and the moment that he was placed in a spacious chamber, in a large and comfortable bed that was stuffed with goose feathers and soft silk pillows, he was asleep in a matter of moments. When he woke, the maester told him that he had been asleep for over 5 days, and both Elia and the babes were almost completely recovered. While Ned knew the maester had no reason to lie him, he had wanted to see his family with his own eyes to make sure of it for himself. Elia had been placed in a bedchamber with a bed easily capable of holding 3 men of Lord Wyman's size. She looked almost pale, too pale. But once she saw him, the smile she gave him could still threaten to outshine the sun itself. She had a glass of hot spiced wine with a squeeze of a raw lemon mixed in, and she had been nibbling on goat cheese and black olives and some fresh baked bread. Ned had sat with her for close to an hour before he had gone to check both of the boys. When he walked into the nursery of White Harbor and saw both of the boys playing with a wooden wolf and a set of small wooden soldiers, painted in the colors of House Marndale bearing merman on their little wooden shields, all under the careful eye of a big-boned, heavy-breasted septar with a face lined like old leather and with eyes as hard as sleet, eyes meant to watch out for any mischief. He spent as much time with them as he could, more than he had done with Elia, it ashamed him to admit as he looked back on all of it now. The sky had still been light when he had walked into the nursery, but when Lord Wyman had invited him to sup with him in his own private solar, an invitation that he couldn't have refused even if he had wanted to, the sky had turned black and there had been a sharp chill in the air. Lord Wyman was a man who loved to eat, everyone in the north knew that. His lord father had been much the same, and in truth what could be expected when your seat was situated in a place of great bounty. White Harbor was surrounded by fertile lands to grow crops and to raise cattle and sheep and aurochs, waters full of life and able-bodied fishermen that went out every day, and trading ships that brought in foods and spices from the lands across the oceans every single day. Ned never considered himself a greedy man, but he didn't doubt that if he had been raised at White Harbor as well, then he mostly likely would not exactly be a small man. Lord Wyman's generosity clearly extended to his table as well. Ned didn't think he had ever eaten as well as he had done that night. Capons that had been drowned in butter and served with carrots and raisins and parsnips and red grapes mixed together, freshly caught cod that had been fried and was served with peas and onions, crab legs coated with salt and served with butter and mashed neeps, a hot crab pie with roasted squash, lamprey pies, squids, a fish stew thick with cream, clams and oysters with a tart vinegar, and with every single course there had come fresh baked bread and plenty of butter and cheeses. Ned had been too full by far to try any of the sweets that had come later, though he had forced himself to sample a lemon cake and 2 lavender biscuits so as to not seem rude, but that did not deter Lord Wyman. He had 3 honey cakes brought out, all of them soaked in extra honey and each of which looked as large as a flour wheel. There were also lavender biscuits, fruit tarts, lemon cakes, a selection of various fruits some of which he had never seen before, cheeses that were veined with sweet wine, and a winter cake, made of fruits and nuts. Lord Wyman had been able to finish an entire honey cake by himself, a few pieces of cheese, 4 lemon cakes, 2 blackberry tarts and half of a winter cake. The food had been taken away, to be shared among the servants and the poor of White Harbor. When all of the food had come and gone, all that was left for them to do was talk. The conversation had started out light enough. Wyman had asked him how Elia and the children had been faring since they had been under his care, and Ned had responded that they were doing well and that he and House Stark owed him and his household a great debt, exactly what Lord Wyman wanted to hear. Wyman had smiled at his words and finished off his cup of wine. From there, Wyman had asked about his father and his siblings, and Ned told him that they were well and that hopefully they would be able to make a visit to White Harbor as one. Ned didn't know how much the rest of the Lords of the North knew about Brandon fleeing, but the safest bet was to assume that they all knew nothing about it and to act like he knew nothing as well. The rest of the night had slipped away, and once all the niceties had been said, Ned stood up and made his way to Elia's chamber. His wife had been asleep when he made his way to her, but that didn't stop him from climbing into bed and wrapping his arms around her. A full belly and the sound of her breath and the comforting weight of her in his arms drew him off to sleep. The next morning, Ned knew that they had to continue their journey on to Winterfell. Lord Wyman was quick to offer his roof for as long as they required it, but denied him with as much grace as he could. All he had asked for was a wheelhouse for Elia and the babes to travel in and a stallion for himself. The Lord of White Harbor gave him what he needed and more, a small escort of 10 knights to ensure they made it back to Winterfell safely. He didn't have to, but Ned couldn't deny that the escort did make him feel slightly better as they raced onward to Winterfell. He was also thankful that the escort wasn't overly large either. It was large enough to dissuade any bandits or brigands on the road from trying to attack them, but it wasn't so large that they would find themselves making no time at all. Hoster Tully had far less distance to travel, and Ned had wasted far too much time sleeping. He should have woken up earlier and rode to Winterfell while leaving Elia and the children in Wyman's care till all was done. If war came to the north, then White Harbor might be one of the safest places for her to be. Not that Elia would hear it. She refused to be left, even though Ned tried to tell her that she had been on death's door, that she needed to stay here and rest with the babes to regain her strength. Alas, she wouldn't be told, and she made it clear to him that he would ask Lord Wyman to supply a wheelhouse for both herself and the babes to travel in. They would not be separated again. 6 days after leaving White Harbor, they had arrived back in Winterfell. He hadn't entirely been sure what he had been expecting when he rode through the gate of the castle, knights surrounding him at every side and the wheelhouse trundling after him. No, that was a lie. When he had read Lia's letting in the Water Gardens of Dawn, the words chilling him to the bone so not even the bright and brilliant sun of dawn in the clear blue sky could warm him, he had been expecting to arrive back to utter chaos. He was disappointed in that regard. There were no fires burning, nor armies laying siege to the castle, nor even any of his father's bannermen gathering here to gain their strength. The glass houses stood as they always did, and stable boys tended to the horses. Ned had caught sight of Hodor once, had ridden in, bringing in 2 large bales of hay over his shoulder, and serving girls were drawing buckets of water from the well and carrying them into the kitchens. His father had explained it all soon enough once he had presented himself to him in the main hall with Elia at his side. The chaos had passed a few days after Brandon had left, and now they were simply waiting for Lord Hoster to arrive. 2 days ago a raven had arrived from Moat Cailin that the Lord of Riverrun, his brother, and 300 swords were riding up the causeway. Ned wasn't a fool. He knew that Hoster couldn't hope to take Winterfell or even threaten it with only 300 men at his back, but the simple fact he had brought armed men with him was message enough. 3 more days had passed since then, and now they were simply waiting for Lord Hoster to arrive in the small private dining room. More than anything, at this moment all Ned wanted was to have his wife at his side, but the day after they had arrived back in Winterfell, another fever had fallen onto her, and the Maester had confined her to their bedchamber with no visitors other than the Maester himself. He did not believe that she was in much actual danger, simply that she had exhausted herself, and with her delicate constitution it had been more hard on her than it would have on most, and all she truly needed was rest. He reminded himself to go and check on her as soon as this was done. At the moment he and his father, Lyanna and Benjen, were the only ones standing in the dining room as they waited for Lord Hoster to be brought to them. Ned wasn't sure if it was a smart move or not. A Lord Paramount being brought to another could be seen as insulting, as though the Lord was somehow beneath them, but at the same time this was Winterfell, his Lord Father's lands, the seat of his power and the heart of the North. Perhaps the hidden warning would serve Lord Tully well when it came to it. The door to the room opened, and it wasn't Lord Hoster, but it was a Tully. Lady Catelyn's face was pale, her blue eyes were as hard as stone, and her red hair bound in a hairnet. Her dress was velvet, dyed black with pearls around her neck and moonstones in her hairnet. It took Ned a moment to realize that she was in mourning, though for who he couldn't quite be sure. According to Lia, she had been spending the past few weeks barricaded in her room and refusing to come out after she had sent her letter which had brought her father on his way to the north. She wasn't refusing to eat at the very least, and that indeed was something. The last thing they needed was her starving together while she was their guest. Gods old and new, how did everything go so very wrong? Prince Doran's words floated in front of his head and he shook them away. He refused to believe it. Father surely wouldn't do such a thing. He couldn't truly know anything of Brandon and Ashura. His father wouldn't have turned a blind eye and watched as his brother destroyed his own life, throw his birthright away. He wouldn't do that to Brandon, he wouldn't do that to him. He couldn't. Lady Caitlin let her eyes drift over all of them for a moment before she straightened her spine as she stared straight at Lord Ricard. My lord, I see that my father has not arrived as of yet. Do we know when he will be here? Ricard Stark examined her for a few moments and then spoke out. I don't doubt he will be much longer at all, my lady. My scouts reported sight of a train coming this way, 300 men at least. I would say they will be here soon enough. Why don't you take a seat for now? Might I send for you some food from the kitchens? You must needs keep your strength up, for yourself and for the child. Lady Caitlin frowned slightly as her hands dropped to cup the gentle swell of her belly, noticeable now even through the thick fabric of the dress. That was his nephew or his niece in there, and Brandon had abandoned them. Ned wasn't blind to what his brother was. He knew that he liked to ride and drink and whore, but he never thought for a moment that he would abandon the woman he wed, certainly not when she was carrying his child. He was wrong about, what else had he been wrong about? No, I thank you my lord, but I am not hungry at the moment. I think I shall wait for my father to come before I eat. Caitlin Tully did not break her eye contact with him as she pulled out a chair from the table and sat down in it. Ned knew that some people could call him cold, but right now Lady Caitlin was as cold as ice and just as dangerous. Not that he could truly blame her for that, of course. Lord Ricard nodded and sat back down in his own chair and gestured for his children to take their own seats, which they all quickly did. Brandon's absence was keenly felt. The man didn't know when to shut up, and often that had always irritated him, but now that he wasn't there to irritate him, he found that he missed more than words could say, the absence like a knife to his own heart. A silence fell on the room then, which was only occasionally broken by the sound of a horn of ale being raised to lips or someone letting out a cough. In the long stretches of silence that never seemed to end, all he wanted was Elia at his side to help him through all of this. A smaller, warmer hand to hold. Gods, this couldn't be over soon enough. After what had felt like hours, the door to the chamber opened once again and the Maester of Winterfell scurried in, his chain jiggling with every step that he took and filling the air with the soft chink of metal. He seemed older than Ned had remembered him, and there was worry in his eyes. My lord, Lord Hoster and his host are heading up the road as we speak with all haste. I imagine they will be here within the hour. Shall you come to the courtyard to welcome them? His father brought his horn of ale to his lips and took a sip from it. No, I think not. Lord Hoster has taken it upon himself to come this far without my invitation, and I am not going to trouble myself more than I should. Go and greet him, Maester, and then bring him here to me and send word down to the kitchens to send the food up for us. The Maester bowed his head after a moment and then left the room while Lady Caitlin stared intently over the table at his father. Ned imagined that if she could convince herself to do it, to lower the armor of her courtesy, then she would be sending Lord Ricard a glare that would be able to cut through his father like a crossbow bolt through a steel breastplate. Thankfully, the silence that fell on them after the Maester had left was a brief one, as he soon returned with Lord Hoster and his brother, Sir Brynden. As soon as they walked in, Caitlin stood up from her chair and walked over to them and embraced her father for a long moment before letting him go and pulling her uncle into an embrace that lasted just as long. As his daughter was distracted with her brother, Lord Hoster strode forward and stared at Lord Ricard, who had not rose to greet him for a moment before he bent his head slightly. Lord Ricard, I thank you for inviting us into your hall and for bringing us to your table. Such a great honor you do to us. As one Lord Paramount to another, I thank you for it. I hope you know that if you arrived in Riverrun after a long journey, I would offer you the exact same hospitality. I have no doubt about that at all, my Lord of Riverrun. Please, take a seat, and you as well, Sir Brynden. To have such a well-known knight at my table is an unexpected joy. I have asked for some food to be brought up to us. Even in the dead of winter, let it never be said that I would suffer a guest to be hungry while he is under my roof. I thank you. The courtesy was cold as the Lord of Riverrun strode forward and took hold of his seat and sat himself down, his brother sitting on his right while his daughter sat down on his left. Winterfell is as beautiful as I remember it to be. Whoever holds it after the gods see fit to take you into their arms, will be a lucky man indeed, or woman I suppose, if the winds of fate blow us in that direction. Lord Ricard hummed but said nothing as the door to the chamber opened and half a dozen serving men walked into the room with platters topped with bowls of leek and pea soup. The bowls were placed in front of them with each having half a loaf of brown oat bread to dip into the soup, and in Ned's opinion it looked wonderful, but he had little appetite and that seemed to be shared by the rest of the table. Caitlin took a few spoonfuls of the soup so as to appear polite, and despite his lack of appetite Ned forced himself to tear his loaf in half and dipped it into the soup and nodded at Lionel and Benjen to do the same. They were in the dead of winter and no food could go to waste. None of them knew how much longer it was going to last, and every single scrap was to be cleaned away. Soon, regardless of if they truly wished to or not, all of them were eating, though it was not at all a pleasant experience. The air felt heavy, and almost choking. The only sounds that could be heard was the slurping of soup. It was a very fine soup, seasoned with salt and pepper and thickened with cream, and he was sad that he couldn't appreciate more. The bowls were empty and all that was left of the bread was tiny crumbs. As the bowls were cleared away and the servants left to go and bring up the next course, Ricard picked up his horn of ale and took a sip of it before he spoke. "It is such a long journey between Riverrun and Winterfell. I remember making that journey myself. So many times, in point of fact, so many interesting things we spoke of. And Riverrun, has there ever been a more beautiful castle? With its white stone walls and blue-tipped towers and the mighty rivers, I cannot think why you would want to have come this far, in the dead of winter. Let us not waste any more time then, my lord. I will not pretend that I and the rest of House Tully did not feel insulted when we heard about what your son had done, insulting my daughter in such a way, abandoning her while she carried his child. Our grandchild. I trust that my Lord of Stark is just as outraged as I am about this matter. And is also having men hunt down Lord Brandon and his consort, so they can be brought back here and face justice." There wasn't a hint of rage on Lord Hoster's face. It was as calm as a still lake, but that almost seemed to make it worse. A calm sea that hid 1,000 dangers under its surface. His father, thankfully, did not seem to be intimidated. He simply kept his eyes matched with Lord Hoster. "No one is more sorry for me about the insult that your family has suffered, my lord. I do indeed have men out looking for my wayward son, but I am afraid is it not as simple as all that. The north is bigger than all other 6 kingdoms combined, and Brandon is well known and well loved. He has many friends who might hide him, even from me. I cannot say as to where he might be now. Lady Ashura is a lady of Dawn, perhaps they both went there. I have sent a raven, both to the Lord of Starfall and to Prince Doran. The both of them claim that they have not seen them. But I can only take their word for it." The frustration in his voice was growing, and Ned was suddenly glad that there were 2 armed guards waiting outside. "Regardless, I know that this is not your fault, my lord. Every family has their wayward sons." Sir Brynden glanced at his brother then, and his stern face grew even sterner when a frown crossed over his features. He said nothing to his brother's words, but he was clearly not happy, though Lord Hoster paid no mind and carried on. "Regardless, we must move on as we must. Lord Brandon may have fled, but his heir grows in my sweet Caitlin. They will of course be the heir to Winterfell, and its lord or lady when they come of age, with one of your sons serving as Lord Protector of." "No." In the silence that followed his Lord Father's words, Ned was sure that the sound of a pin dropping would be as loud as a war drum. Lord Ricard leaned forward and crossed his arms in front of him as he stared at Lord Hoster, whose calm mask looked like it was very close to slipping. "Your child will not be my heir, nor the heir to Winterfell. I am not leaving it in the hands of a babe, even with your generous offer to have one of my sons serve as Lord Protector." At that moment, Lady Caitlin stood up and folded her hands back onto her belly as she stared down at Lord Ricard. "My lord, I beg of you. I was once your good daughter, and I am still carrying your son's child, your grandchild. You cannot truly wish for them to be set aside, to be left with nothing simply because their father committed a dishonorable act. That is not the reason why, my lady, your wedding to Brandon was not well loved by my bannermen. At many a feast, I heard the whispers. Why had Lord Ricard betrothed his heir to a Southron woman? Were none of the North's fine daughters good enough for him? From Moat Cailin to Last Heath, White Harbour to Torrens Square, my banners bristled at what they see as an insult. Much the same was repeated when the union of my Ned to the Princess Elia was made known. And now, Brandon has fled, and you and your Lord Father would try and make a Southron babe that is not even born yet, heir to Winterfell. The people of the North would not stand for it, and I am inclined to agree with them. One of my sons would be Lord Protector, no doubt about that, but you would remain and raise him as if your right as a mother, to plead loyalty to Tully instead of Stark. I cannot have that. A Lord of Winterfell must be a Lord of the North, a son of Winter. Of course, that is only if he is a son. The child you might bear might be a daughter, an equal chance either way after all. Many of my Lord Bannerman might be more favorable to that. After all, if you birth a daughter and that daughter grows to be Lady of Winterfell, then she would need to wed a man, to birth her own children to be heirs and to help her hold the North. And Winterfell and the lands of my forefathers would pass from House Stark, to the house of another. Northmen are loyal, but never think that means they are such fools to overlook such a chance. But even then, that is only working on the assumption that you would betroth her to the son of a northern house. What happens if you decide that the best match would be to a son of the Riverlands? I do not think you would be such a fool as to do that, my lady, but it is still a risk that I cannot take. He sighed then and shook his head. And that is assuming many things, that the child will be born at all. It is still early yet, that the child will be born living, that the child won't die in its crib. No, I cannot take these chances. Catelyn Tully's eyes shinned with tears, and Ned couldn't help the surge of sorrow he felt for her as he watched her stand there, her shoulders and hands shaking slightly. Even so, she would not let her tears fall, and the sorrow that Ned was feeling for her was joined with a sense of admiration as well. So, that is to be my fate, my lord. Left with nothing, my child to be little better than a bastard. I cannot believe that you would think that right or fair or just. Your child will always have a place here, my lady, not as its heir perhaps, but as a Stark. Take the child back with you to Riverrun once winter has ended, send them back to use. As a squire or a ward or whatever we happen to see fit. A future will be found for them, and they will be provided for. You have my word on that. That did not seem to soothe Lady Catelyn, nor her father, who began to draw to his feet. Rickard, if you think that I am going to suffer this, then you are very much mistaken. Lord Hoster practically spat the words as his brother joined him on his feet, not as angry as his brother appeared to be at first glance, but he was certainly not at all happy either. Ben, Lyack. I want you both to go and tell the cooks that we will not have any need for the further courses. Have the leftovers spread among the castle servants and the people of Winter's Town. Ned made sure that he would give his thanks to the older gods later that night when his brother and sister but seemed to sense that it would not be for the best to argue, and scurried out of the room as quickly as they could. Thought Lyanna did cast a look back briefly before she stepped through the door. Sir Brynden stepped forward and placed his hand on Lady Catelyn's shoulder, and when he spoke his tone reminded Ned of his grandfather. Cat, you look tired. Why don't you go and lie down? The babe will need its rest, and it won't do for you to be upset. Go and lie down and we will come and find you later. For a moment, Catelyn looked like she was about to argue, but the moment passed and she nodded. Her uncle pressed a kiss to her forehead and she left the room. Meaning that all that was left was Ned, his Lord Father, Lord Hoster and Sir Brynden, and none of the men looked happy. It was Lord Hoster who finally broke the silence. I don't know what it is you're thinking of pulling here, Rickard, but I warn you. It will not work the way that you think it will. I will not allow my daughter to be dragged all this way, to be humiliated and insulted with a babe in the belly when your bastard of a son ran off with a Dornish slut and her whelp. And I warn you, Hoster. I will not be threatened, and I will not allow House Stark to fall into nothing, to have our lands stolen away from us. What my son did was unforgivable, and I have stripped him of his status as my heir to my lands and titles as well as any claim to Winterfell. He has nothing now aside from the Lady Ashura. And what does my daughter have, other than a child that is little better than a bastard? Despoiled, that is what she is now. I cannot make another match for her as she is. She will left in Riverrun as an old maid. A spinster. Hoster slammed his hands down on the table as he stared at Rickard, rage woven into every single inch of his fact. My little cat is dear to me. I will not let her suffer that. I do not intend to let her. Lady Catelyn is a victim in all of this, and I do not intend to let what has happened to her go unanswered or indeed unpaid back. Then we are in agreement. Lady Catelyn will marry your Benjen and he will be made the heir to Winterfell. Ned wasn't sure who was more dumbfounded by the Lord of the Trident's words, his father or the Riverlord's brother. It is not a perfect solution, to be sure. If things were different, then I would suggest that she marry your Ned. The law states that he is the new heir if Brandon is disinherited, but he is already wed and his union has brought forth children, so his marriage to Princess Elia cannot be annulled. Ned had never really stopped and thought what it meant if Brandon was disinherited before now. It meant that he was the heir of Winterfell. That he was going to be the Lord of Winterfell someday. He honestly didn't think that he had ever heard of something more terrifying than that. Winterfell was always meant to be for Brandon, how could he take that from him? But then, if what Lord Hoster wanted happened, then it would seem that he did not need to worry about it. His Lord Father did not look fazed. "No, you're right, my lord, it cannot. But I do not intend to wed her to Benjen. He is too young, and when he will be betrothed, it will be to a northern girl, to ensure to my Lord Bannerman that they are not forgotten. However, you are well aware that matters in the Vale are not settled as of yet when it comes to inheritance. Jon Arryn's heir is his nephew, Elbereth Arryn. He needs a bride, and I am sure that if the child is kept out of sight, that a union between the great houses of the Riverlands and the Vale will not be an unsubstantial one. Perhaps, or maybe I will take my grievances to the king." The threat, both the spoken one and the one that was not, were not subtle, but they hung in the air. "You forget that I am the closest to the capital. I have friends, and many of them speak about the anger he bears for you and for Lord Tywine, much and more he would be so interested to learn." His father pushed his chair back and stood up, the two great lords staring at one another. "I don't doubt that he would, though of course for all the king is mad, he is not a fool. He will wonder how you came by this information. If you tell him true, then he will burn you alive, and if you lie to him and he suspects, he will burn you alive, and if I am dragged before him to be burnt, I shall have nothing to hide and he will burn you alive." They stared at each for a moment that seemed to drag on into forever before Lord Hoster scuffed and stepped back. "Very well then, that seems to be the end of it. But don't imagine that I will forget this, Rickard. I assume that we can trouble you for a bed for the night before we ride back home on the morrow." "Of course you may stay the night, Hoster." Lord Tully scoffed, and that seemed to be the end of it once he and his brother had left and Ned had the sudden desire for the largest pitcher of ale that men could carry. What just happened, exactly? What has been happening? None of it has made any sense. His father stared at him in that way that made him feel like he was a little boy once again and that he was about to be in trouble. "I am not entirely sure how much Doran told you, but first and foremost you have to understand that I love your brother more than anything except for you and Ben and Lia. Before I go any further, do you understand that?" Ned didn't know what he could say to that, so he simply nodded. "For all that I love your brother, and I do. I know what he was. If he had not grown up by now, then he is not going to. But what choice did I have? I would not and could not kill him lest I rip my heart in two and be cursed as a kinslayer, nor did I have any mechanism to legitimately disinherit him for someone more suited. So, I created one. To be sure, this was not planned since the beginning. Prince Doran certainly intended to improve his sister's prospects, which was why he sent Ashera and Lauren with her. And yes, I know who Lauren was the moment that I looked at her. I know a Stark when I see one. The girl was Brandon's blood, and what Prince Doran had intended became obvious to me. I sent a raven to Sunspear, letting him know that I knew and that luckily for him, it would work out best for the both of us. I kept close eyes. Maids and wet nurses and stable boys would bring me word of what was happening between them, of the conversations that they were having. I lightened the guard on the walls of Winterfell when it became clear to me that Brandon was going to make his move, and the gate that he slipped out of was left unguarded for a reason. Brandon didn't get away. I let him go. So, I could be your heir instead. Ned let out a breath and closed his eyes as he tried to understand any of it, and found that even with all he said he could not. "You risked war with the Riverlands, just for that?" "Not at all. Many in our little alliance were worried about the power that Hoster was gaining. Catelyn married to your brother, himself Lord of Riverrun, and Lady Lyse trying to seek a betrothal to Sir Jaime. We couldn't have that, so we decided to clip his claws. Some would say that a match to the Arryns of the Vale is better than the Starks, but Jon Arryn is your foster father and Elbereth is your friend. They are more with us than with Hoster, and he knows that. But he wants a match for Catelyn, and he will take that if it is offered. She is spoiled goods now, after all, I am sad to say. And at any rate, he knows he has nothing. He cannot go to the king, for doing so and unveiling us would mean that he would have to confess his own part. King Aerys is not the most forgiving of men, and he does deliver kind and merciful punishments. Hoster had chosen his side, and right now he knows it. When worst comes to worst, he will side with us. And if he does not, we will deal with that when it comes. At any rate, we will not be having war with the Riverlands today. Ned didn't think he had ever felt so tired in his entire life, and it felt as though someone was swinging a warhammer around in his head, trying to crack his skull open like Lord Wyman had done with those crab legs to suck on the tasty flesh below the red shell. Father, I don't want to be the heir to Winterfell. It's an honor, but it's not one I want. It's Brandon's right, it's meant for him. His father's gaze softened then, and he remembered a time when he had ran to him after some stable boys had mocked him for his too long face. Mother would ever have been his first choice, but her time with Lyra had been drawing near, and thus in his desperation he had run to father instead, who had held him and told him that it was all right to be hurt, to be scared, but never to run. Starks didn't run. I know you didn't want it, but this is your duty now. And Starks have always done their duty, Ned. You cannot be any different when it comes to this. I will leave you to your thoughts. Go and see your wife.